Imagine a warm fire, not the fire in a hearth or a stove, something contained, domesticated, predictable. A fire outside, on open ground, with the night around it and the sky overhead. A fire that is the only light for a long distance in every direction, so that beyond its circle of warmth and illumination, the world is simply dark. The kind of dark that does not exist in the modern world except far from cities, in places where the sky still does its ancient work of being an unmediated window into the universe. Someone is telling a story. You cannot hear the words clearly enough to understand them. The language is not one that exists anymore. The sounds are not ones that any human throat has formed for 10,000 years. But the cadence is unmistakable. The rise and fall of a voice holding an audience, the pause before something important, the quickening when the story reaches its crisis, the hush that falls over the listeners as the story approaches its end. It is a story about water that came and did not stop, about the world before the water and the world after, about a specific person, a specific man or woman, named or unnamed, who was warned and who survived, and who carried something forward across the catastrophe, about the animals preserved somehow, about the mountain where the water finally receded, about the world that began again, smaller and diminished, in the silence after the flood. This story, in versions that vary in their details and in the specific cultural vocabulary that shapes them but that share an unmistakable structural skeleton, has been told by human beings for as long as we have been able to trace the telling. In every part of the inhabited world, in cultures that had no contact with each other, in languages that share no common ancestor, in cosmological frameworks that agree on almost nothing except this one thing. The world was destroyed by water. Someone survived. The world began again. My name is Arthur, and tonight we are going to sit with the most widely distributed story in human history. The story that has more versions in more languages, across more cultural traditions, than any other narrative ever told. The story that every ancient civilization, every one of them, has some version of. The flood. And the question we are going to sit with is not whether the flood happened. We have explored that question in other videos in this series. We have discussed the sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the geological evidence for catastrophic flooding events that would have affected coastal populations worldwide. The question tonight is something different. Tonight, we are asking, why does everyone remember it in the same way? Not just the fact of the flood, that could be explained as a universal human experience of catastrophic water, but the specific structure of the story, the chosen survivor, the divine warning, the boat or raft or floating vessel of some kind, the animals preserved, the birds sent out to find land, the mountain where the water recedes, the sacrifice and the divine covenant afterward. These structural elements appear across traditions that could not have borrowed them from each other. That is the puzzle. And it is a puzzle that the conventional explanations have not fully solved. Before we go any further, I want to say hello to whoever is listening right now. I don't know what time it is for you. I don't know whether you're somewhere in bed with this playing quietly or somewhere else entirely. I don't know whether you've been following this series from the beginning, in which case you already know the Sumerian king list and the comet and Göbekli Tepe and the Great Pyramid. And tonight's video is the one where we gather those threads together. Or whether this is your first time here. If it's your first time, welcome. Arthur's Sleepy History is a place for the questions that resist easy answers. We go slowly. We hold the evidence carefully. We try to be honest about what we know and what we don't. Tonight, we are going to be in the deep past for a long time, and there is no rush. If you've been here before, hello again. Tonight, we're pulling together the threads from all the previous videos in this series, the flood myths and the impact hypothesis, and the prehistorical monuments and the ancient traditions that claim a world before ours. Tonight is where the pattern becomes visible. Leave me a comment if you feel like it. Tell me where in the world you are and what time it is. Those comments mean more than I can easily say. And if you want to be here every time I find something worth sitting with, the subscribe button is just there. All right, let's count the stories. The academic literature on flood myths is extensive and goes back to the 19th century, when scholars first began systematically comparing the Genesis narrative with the Sumerian and Babylonian texts that predated it. Since then, anthropologists, folklorists, and comparative mythologists have catalogued flood traditions from cultures across the globe. The numbers vary depending on methodology, what counts as a flood myth, how strictly you require the structural elements to match, how you handle traditions where the flood story is embedded in a larger cosmological narrative. But the typical scholarly estimate is that there are between 200 and 600 distinct flood traditions worldwide, with some researchers counting over 1,000 if you include every culture that has any story involving a catastrophic flood. 200 to 600 is a very large number. It represents every inhabited continent, every major linguistic family, cultures at every level of material complexity, from small hunter-gatherer bands to sophisticated ancient civilizations. And the most striking thing is not the number, it is the geographic distribution. Flood traditions are found in cultures that had no historical contact with each other at the time their traditions were formed. The flood myths of the indigenous peoples of North America were not borrowed from the Sumerians. The flood traditions of Aboriginal Australians were not borrowed from the ancient Hebrews. The flood stories of the Andean peoples of South America were not imported from ancient Greece. These are independent traditions. They developed in isolation from each other, and yet they tell the same basic story. Why? The conventional explanations fall into several categories, and it is worth taking each one seriously before we assess where they fall short. The first conventional explanation is the most obvious one. Flooding is a universal human experience. Every culture that has ever lived near water has experienced floods. Rivers overflow their banks. Coastal areas are inundated by storm surges. Tsunamis strike coastlines. Flash floods sweep through valleys. Water is both the source of life and the source of destruction for every agricultural and coastal community in the world. Given this universality of experience, the argument goes, it is not surprising that every culture has stories about devastating floods. The stories are not about the same flood. They are about different floods, different times, different places, all independently inspiring the same narrative response to the same kind of catastrophic experience. This explanation has real merit. Flooding is universal. The fear of catastrophic inundation is one of the most primal human fears, rooted in the direct experience of a world where water can destroy in hours what takes years to build. Any theory of flood myths must account for this obvious baseline. But the baseline explanation runs into a specific problem. It explains the floods, but not the structure of the flood stories. If the flood myths were simply independent responses to independent flood experiences, we would expect them to be structurally diverse, each culture developing its own specific narrative response to its own specific experience of flooding. The Mesopotamian flood story would be different in structure from the Indian one. The Greek flood story would be different in structure from the Andean one. but they are not structurally diverse. They are structurally similar, not in their surface details and the names, the specific divine actors, the particular animals involved, the exact mechanism of warning, but in their deep structure, the chosen survivor, the warning, the boat, the animals, the birds, the mountain, the covenant. These elements appear across traditions that should, if the baseline explanation is correct, have developed their own unique structural responses to their own unique flood experiences. The convergence of structure across independent traditions is the thing that the baseline explanation cannot account for. The second conventional explanation invokes the psychology of C.G. Jung, specifically the idea of the collective unconscious and its archetypes. Jung proposed that the human psyche contains, beneath the personal unconscious, a deeper layer that is shared across the species, a collective reservoir of images and patterns that appear in myths, dreams, and religious traditions worldwide, not because they were transmitted culturally, but because they are structural features of the human mind itself. In this framework, the flood myth is an archetype, a universal human pattern that arises spontaneously in every culture, because it is built into the deep structure of human psychology. The flood represents chaos, dissolution, the return of the world to undifferentiated potential before a new creation. The boat represents the self, the container of consciousness that survives the dissolution. The chosen survivor represents the ego, the individual consciousness that is preserved through the chaos of the unconscious. Jung's framework is elegant and has been enormously influential, and it may contain something true. The flood story does operate at the level of deep human psychology, and its power as a narrative is partly due to the resonance it has with universal human experiences of loss and renewal, of the world ending and beginning again. But as an explanation for the specific structural similarities across flood traditions, the Jungian framework has a significant limitation. It predicts that cultures will independently develop flood-like narratives, stories about dissolution and renewal, but it does not specifically predict the boat, the birds, the mountain, the covenant. These are not psychological archetypes in any obvious sense. They are specific narrative elements. Why does every culture that has a flood myth also have a boat? Why do so many of them specifically include the sending out of birds to test whether the land has dried? Why does the survivor always end up on a mountain? These specific elements are not obviously derivable from the psychology of the collective unconscious. They look like specific memories of a specific event or type of event, rather than universal psychological symbols. The third conventional explanation involves cultural diffusion, the idea that flood myths spread from a single original source, transmitted through cultural contact across the ancient world. In its most specific form, this argument identifies ancient Mesopotamia as the source, the Sumerian and Babylonian flood traditions, being among the oldest written versions, spread outward through trade and cultural contact, eventually reaching every part of the inhabited world. This explanation has some support for the traditions of the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean world. The similarity between the Gilgamesh flood narrative and the Genesis narrative is well explained by cultural transmission. The ancient Hebrews had direct access to Babylonian traditions during the Babylonian exile, and the structural similarity between the two accounts reflects a genuine historical relationship. But diffusion from ancient Mesopotamia cannot explain the flood traditions of Aboriginal Australians, who were isolated from the Old World for at least 40,000 years before European contact. It cannot explain the flood traditions of the indigenous peoples of North and South America, whose ancestors crossed the Bering Land Bridge and lost contact with the Old World populations more than 15,000 years ago. For the diffusion argument to account for the global distribution of flood myths, the diffusion would have to have occurred before the separation of the world's populations, before the colonization of Australia, before the peopling of the Americas. That pushes the origin of the flood tradition back to at least 40,000 years ago, long before the oldest written versions, and long before the conventional beginning of civilization. At that point, the diffusion argument is no longer an alternative to the shared event argument. It is simply saying the flood tradition originated at some point before the global dispersion of modern humans, which means it originated from a shared experience that all modern human populations are descended from, which is another way of saying they all remembered the same thing. What was that thing? At 40,000 years ago, it is not the Younger Dryas. That is more recent. It is something older, something that happened when the ancestral population of all modern humans was still concentrated in Africa or the immediately surrounding regions. Something that entered the narrative tradition of the species at the very beginning of that tradition. Or the diffusion argument is wrong for the non-Old World traditions, and those traditions are genuinely independent developments. Which brings us back to the question of why they are so structurally similar to the Old World traditions. None of the conventional explanations, individually, accounts for all the evidence. The flooding is universal argument explains the prevalence of flood stories, but not their structural similarity. The Jungian argument explains some of the psychological resonance, but not the specific narrative elements. The diffusion argument explains some of the Old World parallels, but not the global distribution. This does not mean the conventional explanations are wrong. It means they are incomplete. And the incompleteness points towards something that the conventional explanations are trying not to say, that a significant number of the world's flood traditions are independent memories of the same event or series of events. That the flood is not just a story, it is a memory. That is the hypothesis we are going to inhabit tonight, not as a certainty, as a possibility worth taking seriously. As the interpretation of the evidence that, when you lay everything out and look at it carefully, is harder to dismiss than the alternatives. The flood happened. Not everywhere, not all at once, not in the simple way that a single narrative can capture. But something happened. Something involving catastrophic water, affecting human populations across a wide geographic range at some point or points in the deep past. That was sufficiently traumatic and sufficiently universal to leave its trace in the oral traditions of every culture on Earth. What was it? When was it? And how did it become the story that every human being in every culture tells their children? Those are the questions for tonight. Let me spend more time with the structural elements of the flood story, because I want to make the case for structural similarity more concrete before we proceed. The structural elements I'm referring to are these: a world-ending flood, a single chosen survivor, a divine warning or instruction that enables survival, a vessel of some kind for preservation through the flood, the inclusion of animals in the survival, a period of floating on the water with the world submerged, the use of birds or other scouts to determine when the flood is receding, the landing on high ground usually described as a mountain, and a post-flood covenant or ritual act that marks the beginning of the new world. Not every flood tradition contains every one of these elements. That would be too much to expect from an oral tradition transmitted across thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. But the majority of the most significant flood traditions contain most of them, and the degree of overlap is far beyond what chance would predict. Let me take the bird motif as a specific example, because it is the most striking and the least likely to arise independently. In the Genesis account of Noah, after the flood has been on the earth for 150 days and has begun to recede, Noah opens the window of the ark and releases a raven. The raven flies back and forth until the waters have dried from the earth, but does not find a resting place. Noah then releases a dove. The dove returns to the ark, having found nothing. 7 days later, he releases the dove again, and it returns with an olive branch, the first indication that vegetation has survived. 7 days after that, he releases the dove a third time, and it does not return, indicating that the land is habitable. In the Babylonian epic of Gilgamesh, the flood hero Utnapishtim sends out 3 birds in sequence to test the state of the waters. A dove first, then a swallow, then a raven. The dove and the swallow return, having found no resting place. The raven does not return, indicating that it has found dry land. Utnapishtim releases the animals and makes a sacrifice. The parallel between these two accounts, 3 birds, the same species, sent out in sequence with the same logic of return or non-return indicating the state of the land, is so close that it is universally accepted as reflecting a common source. The Genesis account and the Gilgamesh account are not independent. They are versions of the same tradition. But now consider the flood tradition from the island of Fiji in the Pacific. The Fijian flood myth involves a great inundation in which only a few people survive on the highest mountains. When the flood begins to recede, they send out birds to test the land. The birds return initially, then eventually do not return, signaling that the land is dry enough to descend to. Fiji is approximately 12,000 kilometers from Mesopotamia. Fijian oral tradition was not influenced by the Babylonian epic or by Genesis. There was no cultural contact between these traditions at the time they were formed, and yet the motif of the birds sent out to test the land appears in both. This is the kind of parallel that challenges the conventional explanations. It is too specific to be a coincidence. It is too geographically remote for direct diffusion. The birds are a real memory, or a real inference from a real experience of what you actually do when you are floating on a flood and you need to know when you can safely land. You send out a bird because a bird will find dry land if any exists, and will return if it doesn't. This is a practical technique, a technique that makes immediate, obvious sense to anyone who has ever been in a boat on flooded water and needed to know if the land had dried. It is not a psychological archetype in any abstract sense. It is a specific practical procedure derived from direct experience of flood survival. The fact that this specific practical procedure appears in flood traditions from cultures separated by 12,000 kilometers and 40,000 years of evolutionary divergence is not explained by coincidence, not explained by diffusion, and not fully explained by the universal experience of flooding. It is explained by a shared experience of a specific kind of flooding, long-duration flooding, the kind that lasts long enough that you need to send out scouts to determine when it has receded, the kind that requires a boat to survive, the kind that leaves you on high ground wondering whether the low ground has dried. And the flooding that fits this description, the slow, prolonged inundation of coastal lowlands by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, is exactly the kind of flooding that occurred globally between approximately 15,000 and 7,000 years ago. The flood traditions of the world may be memories of that inundation, not memories in the sense of a detailed account of specific events at specific times. Memories in the sense of the emotional and narrative residue of a process that affected coastal-dwelling human populations across the globe over the course of thousands of years, that produced, in community after community on continent after continent, the experience of watching a known world disappear beneath rising water, of being forced to higher ground, of waiting and watching, and eventually sending out birds to see if the low places had dried. That experience, repeated independently across dozens of coastal cultures over thousands of years, could independently generate the same structural narrative. Not because humans borrowed from each other, but because the experience itself, the slow inundation of the coastal world, has a specific phenomenology that produces a specific kind of story. The boat, because you need one to survive on flooded coastal land. The animals, because your animals are your food and your livelihood, and you would bring them. The birds, because you need scouts who can fly to find land. The mountain, because that is where you end up, the highest ground, the last thing the water covers. The covenant, because when you survive something like that, you make a promise to the forces that let you survive, to the world, to yourself. These elements are not arbitrary, they are the natural narrative encoding of the experience of sea level rise. And their appearance across independent cultures is not mysterious once you accept that the experience was genuinely global. What remains mysterious, what the sea level rise explanation does not fully account for, is the figure of the divine warning. The chosen survivor who is told in advance that the flood is coming and is given specific instructions for survival. Sea level rise, even rapid sea level rise, does not warn specific individuals. It does not choose survivors. It simply rises, and whoever happens to be on high ground survives, and whoever is on low ground does not. The divine warning is either a theological addition, the survivors looking back on their experience, attributing their survival to divine favor rather than geographical luck, or it is something else. Something that points toward a more specific event than simple sea level rise. An event that was not gradual, but sudden. An event that someone might plausibly have been warned about because it was preceded by signs that the knowledgeable could read. The impact hypothesis suggests exactly this kind of event. A sudden, catastrophic occurrence, the airburst of a fragmented comet, the explosion of a torrid debris fragment in the atmosphere, that would have been preceded by astronomical signs, readable by anyone who had been watching the sky carefully. A meteor shower of unusual intensity in the days or weeks before the main event. Unusual lights in the sky, perhaps even specific astronomical configurations that, to a culture that watched the stars for exactly this kind of signal, would have been recognizable as the precursor to something dangerous. In this scenario, the divine warning in the flood traditions is not a theological invention. It is the memory of an astronomical warning system of the signs that preceded the catastrophe, interpreted through the only framework available to the people who observed them as a message from the gods. The chosen survivor is the one who read the signs correctly, who understood what the unusual meteor shower meant, who took action, built the boat, gathered the animals, moved to higher ground before the catastrophe struck. This is speculative. I want to be clear about that. But it is a speculation that fits the specific character of the flood traditions more precisely than the alternatives. The divine warning is not a late theological addition. It is one of the most consistent elements across the most diverse traditions. And its consistency suggests that it reflects something specific about the experience of the flood, something that happened, or that the tradition encodes as having happened, that is not captured by the simple picture of gradual sea level rise. Something warned someone, something specific enough and dramatic enough to be memorable across 10,000 years of oral tradition. What was it? That is the question we will keep inhabiting as the night goes on. Let me take you through the major flood traditions one by one, because the structural comparison deserves more than a summary. I want you to feel the weight of each one, not just as a data point in a comparative argument, but as a story, as something that was told by someone, around a fire or in a temple or in a boat on a river, to people who listened and remembered and told it again. Each of these traditions has been alive in the mouths and minds of human beings for thousands of years. Each one carries something real, even if we cannot always say precisely what that real thing is. Let's start with the text we know best, or think we do. The story of Noah in the book of Genesis is the most widely known flood narrative in the world, at least in the English-speaking and Western-influenced parts of it. It is also a story that most people who know it do not know as well as they think they do, because the version that lives in popular culture has been flattened by centuries of retelling into a cheerful parable about animals boarding a wooden boat in an orderly procession. The Genesis account is not a cheerful parable. It is a story about the destruction of the world, about a God who looked at everything he had made and concluded that it had become irremediably corrupt. That the only solution was to unmake it and begin again. It is a story about a man who was chosen not because he was exceptional, but because he was righteous in a generation that had abandoned righteousness. And it is a story about what it means to survive the end of the world, to carry forward, in a vessel, the seed of everything that had been, into a world that is simultaneously entirely new and utterly bereft. The specific dimensions of Noah's Ark, as given in Genesis, have been extensively studied. The Ark is described as 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits tall. A cubit is approximately 45 centimeters, which gives dimensions of roughly 135 meters by 22 meters by 14 meters. These proportions, approximately 6 to 1, length to width, are close to the proportions of modern cargo ships designed for stability in rough seas rather than speed. Whether the Ark as described is a plausible design for surviving a catastrophic flood is a question that has been studied by naval engineers, some of whom have concluded that the proportions are indeed stable. Whether an Ark of those dimensions could hold representatives of every species on Earth is a question that requires a much more flexible interpretation of what every species means. But these practical questions, interesting as they are not the heart of the story. The heart is the covenant that follows the flood. After the waters recede and Noah and his family and the animals emerge from the ark, God makes a promise. He will not destroy the world with water again. He sets a rainbow in the sky as the sign of this covenant, a permanent, visible reminder of the promise. The rainbow is the first symbol of hope in the biblical narrative, and it appears in the sky precisely because of the water, because the light refracting through the moisture left in the atmosphere after the rain is what produces it. The sign of the covenant is made possible by the catastrophe it marks the end of. That detail, the covenant embodied in the phenomenon created by the flood itself, is theologically sophisticated in a way that is easily overlooked in the popular version of the story. It says, the catastrophe was real. Its traces are still present in the world, and those traces, which you can see every time it rains and the sun comes out, are the permanent reminder of the promise that the catastrophe will not recur. Every rainbow is a covenant. Every time you see one, you are seeing the aftermath of the flood, transformed into a sign of hope. Now let's go to the tradition that predates Genesis in the written record. The Epic of Gilgamesh was composed in Akkadian Babylonia, drawing on Sumerian sources that are older still. The version that is most complete the standard Babylonian version found in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, dates to approximately the 7th century BCE. But the flood narrative it contains reflects traditions that are at least 1,000 years older and possibly much older than that. The flood hero in the Gilgamesh epic is named Utnapishtim, a name that translates approximately as he who found life or he who saw life. He tells his story to Gilgamesh in the 11th tablet of the epic, near the end of the poem, after Gilgamesh has crossed the waters of death to find him. The Utnapishtim narrative is strikingly close to the Genesis account in its structure, while differing significantly in its theological framework. The god Enlil decides to destroy humanity, not because of moral corruption, as in Genesis, but because of noise. The clamour of the human population has been disturbing the divine assembly's sleep. The god Ea, equivalent to the Sumerian Enki, the god of wisdom and water, warns Utnapishtim, speaking through the wall of his reed house in a clever evasion of the divine assembly's decree. Utnapishtim builds a boat, described in specific dimensions that are notably different from Noah's Ark. Where Noah's Ark has a 6-to-1 length-to-width ratio, Utnapishtim's boat is essentially cubic, equally long, wide and tall, approximately 60 meters in each dimension. The cuboid boat is an unusual design, more like a floating platform or a sealed building than a ship. Some researchers have proposed that this specific design reflects a different memory than the Noah story, a different kind of vessel, or a different kind of flood experience. Utnapishtim loads the boat with silver, gold, all living creatures, and his family. The flood comes in the form of an enormous storm. 6 days and 6 nights of torrential rain and surging seas, a darkness so complete that the gods themselves are afraid. On the 7th day, the storm calms. Utnapishtim opens a hatch and the light breaks in. He weeps when he sees the silence and the destruction. Then the birds. A dove released returns. A swallow released returns. A raven released does not return. It has found dry land. Utnapishtim lands on a mountain called Nimush and offers a sacrifice. The gods gather around the sacrifice like flies around a feast. And Enlil, seeing that someone has survived despite his decree, is angry until Ea intervenes, arguing that it was unjust to destroy all life indiscriminately. Enlil relents. He touches Utnapishtim and his wife and grants them eternal life, sending them to live at the mouth of the rivers, at the ends of the earth. The parallels to Genesis are extensive. The birds in sequence, the mountain, the sacrifice, the divine covenant, here in the form of the granting of eternal life to the survivor. The specific parallel of 3 birds sent in sequence, with the raven as the one that finds land. This is so close to the Genesis account that the relationship between the 2 traditions is beyond dispute. What is disputed is the direction of the relationship. Did the Genesis account borrow from the Babylonian? Did both borrow from a common, older source? The scholarly consensus, as we have discussed in previous videos, is that the Hebrew tradition was significantly influenced by Babylonian sources during the period of the Babylonian exile, but that both traditions ultimately draw on older material, possibly Sumerian in origin, possibly older still. Now let's travel east. The Hindu tradition of Manu and the Great Fish is one of the oldest flood stories in the Sanskrit literature, appearing in multiple versions across the Shatapatha Brahmana, the Mahabharata, and the Puranas. The tradition predates the written forms of these texts. It belongs to the oral tradition that preceded them, whose age cannot be precisely determined. Manu, whose name is cognate with the Sanskrit root for human, man, and mind, is a righteous figure, a king, and a sage. He is washing his hands one day in a river when a small fish comes to him and speaks. The fish asks Manu to protect it from the larger fish that threaten to eat it. Manu agrees and places the fish in a jar. As he feeds it, the fish grows. It outgrows the jar and Manu transfers it to a larger vessel, then to a pond, then to a river, then to the ocean. At each stage of growth, the fish asks to be moved because it has grown too large for its current container. When the fish reaches the ocean and fills it, when it becomes the largest creature in the sea, it reveals itself to Manu as the divine, either as Brahma the creator or as Vishnu in his fish avatar Matsya, depending on the version of the tradition. And it tells Manu that a great flood is coming. It instructs him to build a large boat, to take with him the 7 sages and the seeds of all plants, and to wait. The flood comes. Manu ties his boat to the fish's horn with a great rope. The fish pulls the boat through the floodwaters to a northern mountain, the Himavat, or in some versions a specific peak called Naubandana, the binding place of the boat. The flood subsides. Manu and the sages and the seeds begin the work of repopulating the world. The structural parallels to the Genesis and Gilgamesh accounts are evident. The chosen survivor, the divine warning, the boat, the preservation of seeds and living things, the mountain, the new beginning. But there are elements in the Manu tradition that are specific to it, and that add dimensions not present in the Mesopotamian versions. The growing fish, the divine that presents itself in a small, humble form and gradually reveals its true immensity, is a distinctively Indian image, connecting the flood story to the themes of divine avatar and progressive revelation that are central to Hindu theology. The preservation of the 7 sages, figures of accumulated wisdom and spiritual knowledge, adds an emphasis on the transmission of intellectual tradition across the flood that is less explicit in the Mesopotamian accounts. And there is something in the image of the rope tied to the fish's horn, the boat tethered to the divine and pulled through the catastrophe by a force larger than human agency, that carries an emotional weight I find particularly moving. Manu does not pilot his own boat. He does not navigate. He holds on. He trusts the rope, and the rope holds, and the fish pulls him through. That image, survival as an act of holding on to what is larger than you, is not the same as the image of competent, organized Noah who builds to specification and follows instructions. It is a different understanding of what survival requires. Not mastery, trust. Let's go further west. The Greek flood tradition centers on Deucalion, the son of Prometheus. Deucalion is warned by his father, the Titan who gave fire to humanity and is associated with foresight and intelligence, that Zeus has decided to destroy the world. Deucalion builds a chest, sometimes described as a large box or ark, and he and his wife Pyrrha shelter in it during the 9 days and nights of the flood. When the waters recede, the chest comes to rest on either Mount Parnassus, Mount Othrys, or Mount Athos. The location varies across different versions of the tradition. Deucalion and Pyrrha emerge onto a world of silence and mud. They sacrifice to Zeus, who sends Hermes to ask Deucalion what he desires. He asks for people, for the earth to be repopulated. Zeus instructs them to throw the bones of their mother over their shoulders. Puzzled, they interpret this as meaning the stones of the earth as the mother of all living things, the stones as her bones. And they begin throwing stones over their shoulders as they walk. The stones thrown by Deucalion become men, and the stones thrown by Pyrrha become women. This repopulation myth, the people of stone, is striking in its implications. The new humanity, the post-flood humanity, is made literally of the earth, not of divine breath breathed into clay, as in the Genesis creation of Adam. Not born of sexual reproduction, thrown into existence from the ground of the world. The connection between the human and the material, the geological, the physical, the earth as the origin of human beings, is expressed here in a way that feels almost scientific in its emphasis on our material origins. The Greek tradition also carries a specific numerical detail. The flood of Deucalion lasts 9 days and 9 nights. This is not the same number as the Genesis flood, which lasts 40 days, or the Gilgamesh flood, which lasts 6 days and 6 nights. The variation in duration across traditions is one of the places where the independence of the traditions is most visible. If they were all borrowing from a single source, we might expect the duration to be more consistent. The variation in duration may reflect the different flood experiences that different coastal cultures actually had. A sudden impact-triggered flood event would produce a different temporal profile from a gradual sea level rise. A tsunami would produce a very different experience from prolonged inundation. The different numbers may encode different kinds of flooding events, independently experienced rather than variations on a single narrative. Now let's travel north. The Norse flood tradition is different in character from the Mediterranean and South Asian versions, and its difference is instructive. In the Norse cosmological framework, the flood that precedes the world we know is not a moral judgment or a divine punishment. It is a consequence of creation itself. When the gods, the Aesir and the Vanir, killed the primordial giant Ymir and used his body to make the world, the blood from his wounds flooded the world and drowned all the frost giants, ancestors of the giants who would later be the enemies of the gods. All except one. Bergelmir, who escaped in a boat or on a millstone, depending on the version, and became the ancestor of all subsequent giants. This is a cosmological flood rather than a historical one. The water is not rain or a risen sea, but blood, the blood of the primordial being whose dismemberment is the act of creation. The flood is part of the creation process, not a judgment on an already created world. And yet the structural elements are there. The sole survivor, the floating vessel, the survival as the founding act of a lineage. The Norse tradition preserves a memory of catastrophic inundation in a form that has been so thoroughly integrated into the cosmological framework, so thoroughly mythologized, that its historical roots, if it has them, are almost invisible. What remains is the shape, the water that destroys, the vessel that saves, the single surviving lineage that bridges the gap between the world before and the world after. The contrast between the Norse tradition and the Mesopotamian or Hindu traditions is itself informative. In Mesopotamia and India, the flood is relatively recent. It happened in historical or para-historical time to identifiable people in recognizable geography. In the Norse tradition, the flood is cosmic. It happened at the beginning of everything, before the current world existed. This may reflect the different distances of these cultures from the actual events that generated the flood traditions. The Mesopotamian tradition preserves the most detailed and most historically specific version because it is geographically closest to the epicenter of the sea level rise and most directly affected by it. The Norse tradition, geographically remote, may preserve a more attenuated version in which the historical memory has been fully assimilated into the cosmological framework. Or it may reflect a different event entirely. Not the end of the Ice Age sea level rise, but some other catastrophe, specific to the northern European environment that entered the Norse cosmological tradition at a different time and through a different mechanism. Both possibilities are consistent with the evidence, and both remind us that the flood traditions are not a single story with slight variations. They are a family of stories, related, structurally connected, pointing toward related experiences, but diverse enough in their specific content to resist reduction to a single source. What they share is not a story. It is an experience, the experience of a world that ended in water and began again. That experience, or those experiences, are what the traditions are trying to remember. And the question of what, specifically, they are remembering is one we will continue to inhabit. Let me spend more time with the Mesopotamian traditions specifically, because it is the one we have the most detailed written record of, and because the specific details it preserves are among the most informative. We have discussed the Sumerian and Babylonian versions in earlier videos, the Eridu Genesis, the Atrahasis epic, the Gilgamesh flood narrative. But I want to dwell on one specific aspect of the Atrahasis epic that we have not fully explored, the sequence of disasters that precede the flood. The Atrahasis epic is structured around 3 catastrophes, not one. Before the flood comes, the gods send 2 other plagues against humanity. First, disease, a pestilence that reduces the human population. Second, drought, a failure of the rains and the rivers that produces famine. Third, and finally, the flood itself. The sequence of plague, drought, flood is not present in the Genesis account, which moves directly to the flood without the preceding disasters. But it is present in the Atrahasis epic, and it is striking because it maps onto the actual sequence of events at the end of the Ice Age. The transition from the glacial period to the Holocene was not smooth. It involved multiple episodes of climate disruption, periods of cold and drought, interspersed with periods of warming, disease pressure from changing disease ecologies as the climate shifted, and eventually the dramatic sea level rise that we have been discussing. The sequence plague, drought, flood, in other words, is not an arbitrary narrative structure. It is a plausible description of what the end of the Ice Age was actually like for the people who lived through it. The Atrahasis tradition may be preserving not just the flood itself, but the full sequence of climate catastrophes that the Younger Dryas and its aftermath produced. Not a single event, but a generation-long ordeal, plague and famine, and finally the great inundation that eventually ended the world the survivors had known. The emotional weight of the Atrahasis narrative reflects this. It is not simply a story about a flood. It is a story about a world that was being progressively destroyed, one catastrophe at a time, and the survivors' experience of watching it happen. The flood is the final blow, the one that ends everything. But it is the culmination of a process that had already been grinding humanity down for a long time before the waters came. I also want to spend some time with the specific character of Utnapishtim, the Gilgamesh flood hero, because he is, in the narrative economy of the epic, an extraordinarily strange figure. Utnapishtim is the only human being ever granted immortality by the gods. Not semi-divine status, not extended life, but actual immortality, the kind that the gods themselves possess. He lives at the mouth of the rivers, at the ends of the earth, in a place that is explicitly described as beyond the normal boundaries of the human world. Why was he granted this? The Gilgamesh epic makes the motivation clear. Enlil, the god who authorized the flood, was persuaded by the god Ea to grant Utnapishtim immortality as compensation for the injustice of the flood itself. Utnapishtim survived not through his own merit, but through the intervention of a god who felt guilty about the destruction of the world. This is a strange theological move. The flood was unjust. The text acknowledges this explicitly through the mouth of Ea. The survivor of the flood was compensated for the injustice done to him. and the compensation was the one thing that makes him most unlike the rest of humanity. He cannot die. Utnapishtim is the living proof of the catastrophe. As long as he lives, which is forever, the memory of the flood lives. The world before the flood is preserved in some sense in the person of the man who survived it. This is why Gilgamesh seeks him out. Not for immortality in the abstract sense, for knowledge, specifically for the knowledge of what came before, what the world was like before the flood, how it ended, whether the secret of the life that was lost is recoverable. Utnapishtim tells him the story, and then he tells him about the plant at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth. And Gilgamesh goes to find it, and the serpent steals it. And Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed. The circle of the epic closes. The knowledge of the pre-flood world is accessible, Utnapishtim has it, but it cannot be brought back to the post-flood world. It can be told, but it cannot be used. The world before the flood is gone, and its loss is permanent. This is the emotional truth at the heart of the Gilgamesh tradition, and I think it is also the emotional truth at the heart of the flood myth, more broadly. These stories are not ultimately about how the world was destroyed and recreated. They are about loss, about the unbridgeable gap between the world that was and the world that is, about the grief of knowing that something was there and is no longer recoverable. Every version of the flood story carries this grief at its core. Even the most optimistic, the Genesis account, with its rainbow covenant and its fresh start, acknowledges that what came before is gone. The world after the flood is the world we live in, and it is a diminished thing compared to the world that preceded the catastrophe. Why is the post-flood world diminished? In the Genesis account, the decrease in human lifespans after the flood encodes the diminishment. In the Sumerian tradition, the withdrawal of the Apkallu and the weakening of their power after the flood encodes it. In the Egyptian tradition, the retreat of the gods from direct earthly involvement after the end of the Zep Tepi encodes it. Every tradition says the same thing. After the flood, something was lost. The world became smaller, shorter, harder, more purely human, and less divine. What was lost? That is the question that all the flood traditions are, at their deepest level, asking. And it may be the most important question in the whole of comparative mythology. Let me close this part of our journey with a thought about what the flood myths collectively represent in the intellectual history of the species. Before the development of modern geology and paleoclimatology, before we could study ice cores and sediment records and sea level changes directly, the flood myths were the primary evidence that something dramatic had happened at the end of the Ice Age. They were the only record of events that occurred before writing, preserved in the only way that pre-literate cultures could preserve anything, in story. The flood myths are, in this sense, the world's oldest scientific data. Not accurate in their specific details, not reliable as precise records of what happened where and when, but accurate in their broad outlines. The world was once different. Something catastrophic happened involving water. The world that came after was different from the world that came before. Modern geology and paleoclimatology have confirmed all of this in ways that the ancient storytellers could not have imagined. The sea level rise is documented. The Younger Dryas is documented. The meltwater pulses are documented. The extinction of the megafauna is documented. The stories were right. The world did end, not in the way the stories describe, not through a single divine judgment in a specific year, but in the way the world actually ends, through the slow and sometimes rapid accumulation of change that eventually crosses a threshold and produces a world that is recognizably different from what preceded it. And in that recognition, in the awareness that the ancient stories were preserving something true, however imperfectly, there is, I think, a kind of wonder that goes beyond the academic debate about where the flood myths came from and what they mean. They meant we were there. We saw it. We are trying to tell you what it was like. We are still listening. Let me take you to the other side of the world, to a place that had no contact with the Fertile Crescent for at least 15,000 years, since the ancestors of its people crossed the Bering Land Bridge and moved southward through the Americas, losing connection with the old world populations as the ice sheets closed behind them. The Maya. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica is one of the most sophisticated that the Americas produced. At its height, roughly from the 3rd to the 9th centuries CE, though Maya culture extends back several thousand years before and after that. It included cities of tens of thousands of people, a writing system capable of recording complex historical and astronomical information, an extraordinarily sophisticated calendar, and a tradition of astronomical observation that tracked the movements of Venus, Mars, and the Moon, with a precision that rivaled contemporary Old World astronomy. The Maya had their own flood tradition, and it is embedded in one of the oldest and most important texts of the ancient Americas, the Popol Vuh. The Popol Vuh is the creation narrative of the Quiche Maya, preserved in a document written in the colonial period but drawing on material that is much older, on an oral tradition and on painted books that no longer survive. The text describes the multiple attempts of the gods to create human beings, the failures that precede each attempt, and the catastrophes that destroy each failed creation. The third attempted creation of humanity, the creation of wooden people, is destroyed by a flood. The wooden people were not quite right. They had the form of humans, but lacked hearts, minds, and memory of their creators. The gods decided to destroy them. Rain fell from the sky. The ground was flooded, and the wooden people were attacked not just by the water, but by all the objects they had mistreated: their pots, their grinding stones, their dogs, their houses, which rose against them and killed them. The wooden people tried to escape by climbing onto the roofs of their houses, but the houses collapsed. They tried to climb the trees, but the trees shook them off. They tried to enter the caves, but the caves closed against them. There was no escape. The flood of the wooden people is not exactly the same as the flood of Noah or Utnapishtim. There is no chosen survivor, no divine warning, no boat. The flood is not the end of one version of the world and the beginning of another in quite the same way. It is part of a series. The third failure in the gods' project of creation, followed eventually by the fourth and successful attempt. But the structural resonance is there, a world destroyed by water, a divine judgment, a catastrophe that ends one version of humanity and prepares the way for the next. And in the Aztec tradition, which shares deep cultural roots with Maya tradition while developing in a different geographic and historical context, the flood story is more fully developed. The Aztec cosmology describes a series of world ages, called suns, each governed by a different set of divine forces, and each destroyed by a different catastrophe. The current world, the fifth sun, was preceded by 4 earlier suns. The fourth sun was destroyed by a flood. The flood hero of this tradition is a man named Tata, who is warned by the god Tezcatlipoca to hollow out a great cypress tree and shelter inside it with his wife Neni. The flood comes, and the two survive inside the tree. The parallels to the old world flood traditions are evident. The chosen survivor, the divine warning, the vessel, the survival, the new world beginning after the catastrophe. And the Aztec tradition, like the Mesoamerican traditions more broadly, frames the flood not as a unique event, but as part of a cycle, as one catastrophe among many in the long sequence of world ages. The world has been destroyed and recreated multiple times. The flood is one destruction among several. This cyclical framework, the world repeatedly destroyed and recreated, each cycle ending in a different catastrophe, is itself interesting in the context of everything we have been discussing. The idea that the world has been through multiple catastrophic cycles, that the current world is not the first, but the latest in a series, resonates with what the geological record shows. Multiple periods of climate upheaval, multiple mass extinction events, multiple dramatic transformations of the global environment. The Mesoamerican cosmological framework may be encoding in mythological form a genuine deep-time understanding of the Earth's history. Not the specific events that the geological record preserves. The Mesoamerican cultures did not have access to ice cores or sediment records. But the general pattern, the world ends, the world begins again, and the version we live in is not the first. Now let me take you to the oldest living culture on Earth. The Aboriginal Australians have maintained a continuous cultural tradition for at least 65,000 years. Some researchers place the initial settlement of Australia at 70,000 years or more. Their oral traditions are, by any measure, the oldest in the world, and their oral traditions contain flood stories. Not one flood story, many. Diverse, specific, rooted in the particular geography of particular places. The specific coastlines, the specific bays and headlands and offshore islands of the Australian coast that the traditions describe. The research of Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, which we have discussed in earlier videos in the context of the comet and the sea level rise, is most relevant here. Nunn and Reed systematically studied Aboriginal Australian oral traditions that describe coastal geography and found that many of them describe features that are now underwater. Coastlines, islands and bays that were above sea level during the late Pleistocene and were submerged as the sea level rose after the end of the last ice age. The traditions describe specific places: a bay that was once dry land, an island that was once part of the mainland, a river that once had its mouth in a location that is now open sea. When Nunn and Reed mapped these descriptions against the paleographic reconstructions of the Australian coastline, the computer models of what the coast looked like at various stages of the sea level rise, they found that the traditions were accurate. The places described exist. They existed at specific times during the sea level rise, and they were submerged at specific subsequent times. The oral traditions contain accurate geographical information about a coast that has been underwater for between 7,000 and 10,000 years. This is the single most important piece of evidence for the long-term preservation of specific geographical memory in oral tradition. Not a general claim about floods, not a vague tradition about the sea rising. Specific descriptions of specific places that can be verified against independent geological data. The traditions were right. The coast looked like that, at approximately that time, and the implications are profound. If Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have preserved accurate geographical information for 10,000 years, information about places that have been underwater for 10,000 years, then oral tradition is capable of preserving historical information for at least this long. This puts a completely different light on the other flood traditions around the world. If Aboriginal Australian oral tradition can remember a submerged coastline for 10,000 years, then the flood traditions of Mesopotamia, India, Greece and Mesoamerica may also be preserving genuine historical memory. Memories of the same or similar sea level rise events experienced by coastal populations in those regions. The oral tradition capacity required to preserve the Aboriginal Australian coastal memories is extraordinary, but not supernatural. It requires regular ritual recitation of the traditions, strong social sanctions against modification, and the embedding of the information in narrative forms that are highly memorable. All of these are features of oral tradition in cultures that take their traditions seriously. The cultures that produced the world's flood traditions were exactly these kinds of cultures. They took their stories seriously. They embedded important information in narrative. They passed it from generation to generation with care. The question is not whether they could have preserved accurate memory for 10,000 years. The Aboriginal Australian evidence shows that they could. The question is whether the flood traditions are preserving accurate memory or whether they are later elaborations of actual events. Stories that became more elaborate and more structured as they were retold across the centuries. This is a genuine distinction. The Aboriginal Australian evidence is for the preservation of specific geographical information. Specific, verifiable claims about the location and character of physical places. The flood traditions of Mesopotamia and elsewhere make different kinds of claims. Claims about events, about the behavior of the divine, about the character of the survival, that are harder to verify against independent data. But the Aboriginal Australian evidence establishes the principle. Oral tradition can preserve specific, verifiable information for 10,000 years. And that principle, once established, opens the door to taking the other flood traditions more seriously as historical evidence. Nunn and Reed's research has also identified specific Aboriginal traditions that describe not just the geography of the submerged coast, but the experience of the inundation itself. Traditions that describe the sea coming in, the land disappearing, the necessity of moving to higher ground. These are not abstract stories about a flood that happened long ago. They are accounts, filtered through thousands of years of retelling, yes, but accounts nonetheless, of what it was like to watch the coast you grew up on disappear beneath the rising sea. The people who told these stories saw it happen, or their parents saw it happen, or their grandparents. At some generational remove, perhaps very close, perhaps further back, there were actual witnesses to the flooding of the specific places the traditions describe. And they told their children, and their children told their children, and 10,000 years later, the story is still there. That is what human beings are. That is what we do with the most important things that happen to us. We tell them. We keep telling them. We do not let them go. Let me move across the Pacific because the traditions of the Pacific Island peoples add another dimension to the picture. The people of the Pacific, the Polynesians, the Micronesians, the Melanesians, are some of the most skilled maritime navigators in human history. Their ancestors, beginning around 3,000 years ago, colonized the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean using only outrigger canoes and the stars, and the patterns of swell and wind and bird behavior. They reached Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. They may have reached the coast of South America. These are people whose entire cultural world was organized around the ocean. The sea was not something external to their lives. It was the medium in which their lives were conducted, and the sea level rise of the post-glacial period affected them in a way that was perhaps more visceral than it affected the land-based cultures of the Old World. The low-lying atolls of the Pacific, the ring-shaped coral islands that rise only a few meters above sea level, were particularly vulnerable to sea level change. A modest rise in sea level would have inundated the freshwater lenses within a coral atoll, making it uninhabitable. A larger rise would have submerged the land entirely. The Pacific Island traditions preserve extensive memories of lands that sank beneath the sea. In Polynesian tradition, there is a widespread motif of a sunken homeland, a land from which the ancestors came that no longer exists above the water. Some of these traditions have been interpreted as memories of the colonization voyages themselves, stories about the islands left behind as the people sailed further out into the Pacific. But some of them describe inundation rather than departure. The land didn't become too far away to return to. It went under the water. The Polynesian traditions of sunken lands are not geologically verified in the way that the Aboriginal Australian traditions have been. The Pacific is a very large ocean, and the specific submerged features that the traditions might be describing have not been systematically surveyed. But the traditions exist, and they fit the pattern. Coastal and island-dwelling peoples, preserving memories of a time when the sea was lower and the land was different. The African traditions are the least documented of the major regional groups, and this is partly a function of the scholarly history. The collection and study of African oral traditions has been less systematic than the collection of traditions from Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. And partly a function of the oral nature of many of these traditions, which have not been written down in the same way. But flood traditions do exist across sub-Saharan Africa. In West Africa, among the Yoruba of Nigeria, there is a tradition of a great inundation that destroyed the world. Among the Bamileke of Cameroon, there are stories of a flood that submerged the highlands and forced the ancestors to higher ground. In East Africa, among the Kikuyu of Kenya, there are flood traditions that describe a world-ending inundation, followed by the repopulation of the earth from a single surviving family. The East African traditions are interesting in the broader context, because East Africa is the region from which all modern humans ultimately descend. The genetic evidence is clear that modern Homo sapiens originated in Africa, and the oldest populations of modern humans, the San people of southern Africa, the Hadza of Tanzania, various other groups, represent lineages that have been in Africa for the longest time. If any oral tradition preserves memories of the most ancient human experiences, memories that predate the dispersal of modern humans out of Africa 50 to 70,000 years ago, it might be the traditions of the oldest African lineages. We do not know what those traditions contain that might be relevant to the flood question. The systematic ethnographic and oral history work needed to document and analyze the flood traditions of the oldest African lineages has not been done. This is one of the significant gaps in the comparative mythology of floods. But the gap is not an absence of traditions. It is an absence of study. The traditions are there. We have simply not listened carefully enough. And in that gap, in the unstudied traditions of the oldest human lineages, there may be memories of events so ancient that they predate everything else we have been discussing. Memories not of the Younger Dryas or the post-glacial sea level rise, but of something older. The original catastrophe, if there was one, that entered the tradition of the species at the very beginning. We may never recover those memories. The gap between the present day and the experiences they preserve is too long. The transformations too many, the losses too great. But the fact that the gap exists, the fact that we have not yet listened to the oldest traditions, should give us pause before we conclude that we understand where the flood memory comes from. We have barely begun to look. Let me spend more time with the specific evidence from Aboriginal Australia, because I think it deserves more than a summary. It is the most important empirical evidence in the whole flood memory debate, and its implications extend far beyond the specific traditions Nunn and Reid studied. Nunn and Reid's 2016 paper in the Australian Journal of Linguistics, titled Oral Traditions Describe Scientific Knowledge, a new approach to the question of deep human memory, identified 21 specific Aboriginal Australian traditions from around the Australian coastline that appear to describe the submergence of specific coastal features. The researchers matched these traditions against the known paleographic reconstruction of the Australian coastline, using data from sea level curves and sediment cores to determine what the coast looked like at different times, and found that the traditions described conditions that were accurate for specific periods during the post-glacial sea level rise. The traditions come from diverse Aboriginal language groups distributed around the Australian coast. They were collected at different times by different ethnographers. They have no apparent connection to each other beyond the geographical similarity of their subject matter. They are all describing features of the coast near where each group lives, not sharing a common narrative tradition. And yet, they are describing features that were above sea level at roughly the same time, during the post-glacial sea level rise of roughly 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, and that have been submerged ever since. The probability that this consistency is coincidental, that 21 independent traditions from different parts of Australia would all accurately describe coastal conditions from the same geological period by chance, is vanishingly small. The conclusion that the traditions are preserving genuine geographical memory is, in Nunn and Reed's analysis, the most parsimonious interpretation of the data. Some of the traditions are remarkably specific. One, from the Yuwali people of New South Wales, describes a time when the land extended further into what is now the sea, when you could walk to places that are now islands. The tradition says that the sea came in and covered the land, and that the places that were once accessible by foot are now only accessible by canoe. This is precisely what happened when the sea level rose, and the shallow coastal waters of what is now the New South Wales coast were inundated. Islands that were once hills on a coastal plain became islands. Land that was once walkable became seafloor. The tradition is accurate. It is describing a real event, or series of events, that occurred approximately 8,000 to 10,000 years ago. And it has been preserved in recognizable form across roughly 400 generations of telling. 400 generations. The distance from the present day to the inundation is approximately 400 human generations. Each generation told the story to the next. Each telling introduced small changes, small variations, small elaborations or omissions. And yet, the core of the story, the specific claim that the land once extended further into the sea and was later submerged, survived all 400 transmissions intact. This is what oral tradition can do when the conditions are right, when the story is important enough to be preserved carefully, when the cultural structures that enforce faithful transmission are maintained, when the information is embedded in forms that are highly memorable. The Aboriginal Australian traditions are the proof of concept. They demonstrate that 10,000-year memory is possible in principle. And they establish the baseline against which all the other flood traditions should be evaluated. If the Aboriginal Australian traditions can preserve accurate geographical memory for 10,000 years, then the flood traditions of the ancient Near East, the Genesis account, the Gilgamesh narrative, the Atrahasis epic, may also be preserving genuine historical memory of sea level rise events that occurred at roughly the same time. They would be preserving it less accurately, more mythologized, more thoroughly overlaid with theological interpretation. The Mesopotamian traditions have been through far more cultural transformation than the Aboriginal Australian ones. They have been written down, edited, revised, incorporated into complex religious and political frameworks, translated across multiple languages. The specific geographical information has been generalized into universal narrative. But the core, the world ended in water, someone survived, the world began again, may be just as genuine a historical memory as the Aboriginal Australian coastal traditions, just more thoroughly transformed by the processes of cultural transmission. Let me also spend time with a specific tradition from the Pacific that I find particularly striking. The traditions of the people of the Bismarck Archipelago, the islands off the northeast coast of New Guinea. The Bismarck Archipelago is volcanic and tectonically active. The islands have a history of volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, and coastal changes that goes back thousands of years, and the oral traditions of the people who live there preserve detailed memories of specific catastrophic events: volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, the appearance and disappearance of islands. Some of these memories have been verified against the geological record. A tradition among the people of Karkar Island describes a catastrophic volcanic eruption that destroyed a large portion of the island and killed many people. Geological investigation of Karkar has confirmed that exactly this kind of eruption occurred, approximately 10,000 years ago. The Bismarck traditions, like the Aboriginal Australian traditions, provide independent verification that oral tradition can preserve accurate information about geological events across very long timescales, and they extend the geographical range of verified long-term memory beyond Australia. Together, the Aboriginal, Australian, and Bismarck evidence establishes something important. Oral tradition is not inherently unreliable across very long timescales. Under the right conditions, cultural continuity, careful transmission, the embedding of important information in memorable narrative forms. Oral tradition can preserve accurate factual information for at least 10,000 years. This does not mean that all oral traditions are reliable over all timescales. It means that the dismissal of ancient oral traditions as necessarily unreliable over long periods is not supported by the evidence. Some traditions are reliable. The question is not whether oral tradition can preserve deep time memory, but which specific traditions are doing so and how to distinguish them from later elaborations. And that question, the question of how to distinguish genuine historical memory from later mythological elaboration in the world's flood traditions, is one of the most important methodological questions in the whole field of comparative mythology. Let me say something about the specific geography that the flood traditions point toward, because it has implications for where the most important archaeological evidence might eventually be found. The traditions of the ancient Near East, the Mesopotamian, Hebrew, and related traditions place the flood in the area of the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and the Persian Gulf region. We have discussed at length in earlier videos the Gulf Oasis hypothesis, the idea that the Persian Gulf basin was a fertile valley, heavily populated, before the sea level rise inundated it. If that hypothesis is correct, the flood memory of the ancient Near East is preserving the memory of the inundation of the Gulf Oasis. The specific flood remembered in Genesis and in the Gilgamesh epic is not a global flood, but a regional one. The flooding of a specific, well-populated valley that was the center of culture and civilization for the people who eventually became the Sumerians and their neighbors. From the perspective of the people who lived in the Gulf Oasis and watched the sea come in, the flooding of their valley would have felt like the end of the world. Their entire world, their agricultural fields, their villages, their sacred sites, their burial grounds, their familiar landscape, disappeared beneath the water. The flood was total from their perspective, even if it was not literally global. And the people who survived, who were on the margins of the valley, on the higher ground of what is now Iraq and Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, carried with them the memory of what they had lost, their homeland, their civilization, the world that had been. That memory, transmitted across hundreds of generations, eventually became the written flood traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. It became the story of the 8 antediluvian kings and the 432,000 years of pre-flood civilization. It became the story of Ziusudra and Utnapishtim and Noah. And the specific geography of what was lost, the valley floor of the Persian Gulf, now 60 meters below sea level, is where the physical evidence of the world before the flood might eventually be found. Not in the mountains of Ararat, where tradition says the Ark landed, but in the sea floor of the Persian Gulf, where the world before the flood is buried under meters of sediment and salt water. The flood traditions are, in this sense, a map. Not a precise map, not a map that can be read directly, but a map nonetheless, pointing through all the layers of mythological elaboration towards specific places and specific events that the geological record can eventually verify. We have been following that map across this series. The Sumerian king list pointing toward a pre-flood civilization in the Gulf. The Göbekli Tepe pillar pointing toward a specific date in the sky. The Great Pyramid encoding its builder's understanding of the cosmos in 3 dimensions of limestone. All of these are maps. Maps of a world we have not yet fully explored. Maps that require new tools and new methods to read, but maps nonetheless. And the people who drew them, the people who encoded these memories in oral tradition and stone and clay, were trying to point us towards something real. We are still following the pointing. Let me try to synthesize what we know about the catastrophe the flood traditions are pointing toward. Not a single catastrophe. This is the first thing to say clearly. The evidence points toward multiple events distributed across the period from roughly 15,000 to 7,000 years ago, that together produce the experience that the flood traditions are preserving. The dominant event, the one with the widest geographic reach and the most dramatic effects, is the post-glacial sea level rise. We have discussed this at length in previous videos. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, approximately 21,000 years ago, global sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today. The sea level rise from the glacial maximum to the current level occurred over approximately 15,000 years, but it was not uniform. There were episodes of dramatically accelerated rise, the meltwater pulses, and episodes of slowing or stagnation. The most significant meltwater pulse for the human story is Meltwater Pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,600 years ago and produced a sea level rise of approximately 20 meters in less than 500 years. 20 meters in 500 years is a rate of 4 centimeters per year. That sounds slow, but it translates to significant coastline loss, even in relatively short human timescales. In a flat coastal plain, the kind of terrain that characterizes much of the world's most habitable coastal land, a 4-centimeter rise in sea level can push the coastline hundreds of meters inland in a single generation. The human populations living on the coastal plains of the world at the time of Meltwater Pulse 1A would have experienced this as something between a slow disaster and a fast one, depending on the specific geography. In areas of very gradual coastal gradient, the sea might advance inland by a kilometer or more within living memory. In areas of steeper topography, the effect would be less dramatic. And then there is the Younger Dryas, beginning approximately 12,900 years ago, which we explored in depth in the video on the comet hypothesis. Whether or not the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact, it represents a sudden and dramatic climate shift. A return to near glacial conditions that lasted 1,200 years before the final warming into the Holocene. The Younger Dryas did not primarily manifest as flooding. It was cold and dry in most of the northern hemisphere. But its effects on the coastline were complex. The cooling slowed the glacial melt and therefore slowed the sea level rise. And in some areas, The changed atmospheric circulation produced unusual precipitation patterns, floods in some regions, droughts in others. After the Younger Dryas ended approximately 11,700 years ago, the sea level rise resumed with renewed force. The final major episode of flooding, the inundation of the world's remaining large-scale coastal lowlands, occurred during the early Holocene, from roughly 11,000 to 7,000 years ago. It is during this period, the early Holocene inundation, that the most dramatic coastal losses occurred in the regions where the world's oldest written civilizations later developed. The Persian Gulf basin was largely dry at the beginning of this period and was fully flooded by approximately 8,000 years ago. The flooding of the Gulf basin, the loss of what Geoffrey Rose has called the Gulf Oasis, would have driven the populations of that fertile valley into the surrounding highland regions. This displacement is, as we have discussed, likely part of the origin story of Sumerian civilization. The Black Sea was a freshwater lake, significantly smaller than today, until approximately 7,800 years ago, when the rising Mediterranean broke through the land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus and flooded the lake basin. This event, the Black Sea Flood, was proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman as a possible basis for the Genesis flood narrative. Whether their specific claim is correct is debated, but the event itself is well documented in the geological record. The Black Sea floor still shows the former lake bottom, with the drowned shoreline visible in sediment cores. The flooding of the Black Sea basin would have been dramatic by any measure. Ryan and Pittman estimated that the inflow from the Mediterranean was equivalent to 200 Niagara Falls, and that the lake level rose by up to 15 centimeters per day during the initial breakthrough. The populations living around the former lake's shores, and there were people there as archaeological sites around the present Black Sea coast demonstrate, would have had little warning and little time to respond. These specific events, the Gulf Oasis inundation, the Black Sea flood, the general sea level rise across the Mediterranean and the Atlantic and the Pacific, are the physical reality that the flood traditions are pointing toward. Not a single flood at a single moment. A long, complex, episodic process of the world's coastlines changing beyond recognition, of habitable land disappearing beneath the sea, of coastal populations being repeatedly displaced and forced to adapt to a world that was constantly, inexorably changing around them. The traditions encode this as a single catastrophic event because that is how narrative works. A story needs a beginning, a middle, and an end. A story needs a cause and a consequence. A story needs a protagonist and an antagonist. The complex multi-generational process of post-glacial sea level rise does not have these elements in the raw form in which it was experienced. The narrative compression, the reduction of a 15,000-year process to a single definitive flood, is not distortion. It is the only way to transmit the experience in story form. Now let me talk about what was lost, not in the vague, sentimental sense of the golden age before the flood. Though that sense is real, and we will come to it. I mean specifically, what populations lived in the areas that were inundated, and what did they lose? The areas flooded during the post-glacial sea level rise includes some of the most fertile and most hospitable land on Earth. The continental shelves that were exposed during the glacial maximum, the shallow seafloor that surrounds the continents, now covered by 100 meters of water, were, in many cases, flat, well-watered and ecologically rich. They were exactly the kind of terrain that hunter-gatherer and early agricultural communities prefer. We have discussed the Gulf Oasis, the Persian Gulf Basin, as one of the most significant of these lost landscapes. But it is one example among many. Doggerland, the land that connected Britain to continental Europe across what is now the North Sea, was a substantial landmass, roughly the size of modern Germany, that was inhabited from the end of the last ice age until approximately 8,000 years ago, when the rising North Sea finally covered it. Archaeological evidence from the North Sea floor, including organic material dredged up by fishing vessels, animal bones, and occasional stone tools, suggests that Deucalion was inhabited, probably densely so, for several thousand years before it was flooded. The Sundaland region, the shallow shelf connecting the islands of Southeast Asia, Borneo, Sumatra, Java, Bali, to the Asian mainland, was a landmass comparable in size to India that was largely dry during the glacial maximum and was progressively inundated as the sea level rose. The peoples who lived there, whoever they were displaced onto the surrounding islands and mainland as their world disappeared beneath the rising sea. The coastal plains of India and Sri Lanka, now submerged under the Indian Ocean and the Bay of Bengal, were inhabited during the glacial period by populations that would have been among the ancestors of modern South Asians. Their world, their coastlines, their settlements, their sacred places, is now on the ocean floor. The Australian continental shelf, the shallow water surrounding Australia, now submerged under 10 to 100 meters of sea, was exposed during the glacial maximum and added approximately 40% to Australia's total land area. The people who inhabited the now submerged coastal areas of Australia are the ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians whose traditions Nunn and Reed studied. All of these lost lands, Deucalion, Sundaland, the Gulf Oasis, the submerged Australian coast, the continental shelves of every continent, were inhabited. They were home to human communities of varying complexity, living their lives, developing their cultures, maintaining their traditions, watching the sky. And they were all lost, slowly in most cases, inexorably, a meter at a time, a decade at a time, a generation at a time. The scale of what was lost is difficult to grasp. Not just the land itself, though the land was significant, adding perhaps 10 to 20% to the world's total habitable area, but the cultures, the traditions, the accumulated knowledge of the communities that lived there. Everything they had built, everything they had learned, everything they had stored in their memories and their stories, all of it was disrupted, displaced, forced to adapt to new landscapes with fewer resources and higher population pressure. Some of it survived. The traditions that eventually became the world's flood myths are the survivors, the cultural residue that made it through the disruption, that was important enough to be preserved even as everything around it changed. What didn't survive? We cannot know. We can only know what was preserved and ask what the world must have been like that produced the preserved fragments. The flood traditions tell us that something important was lost. Not just land, not just livelihood, something more fundamental. The world before the flood was different in ways that went beyond the physical geography. It was richer, more divine, more connected to something larger than the ordinary human world. In the Sumerian tradition, the antediluvian world was the age of the Apkallu, the fishmen who brought wisdom. In the Egyptian tradition, it was the Zep Tepi, the first time when the gods walked the earth. In the Hindu tradition, the pre-flood world is associated with the golden age of the Satya Yuga. In the Greek tradition, it is the age of gold, before the progressive degeneration through silver and bronze to the Iron Age we live in. Every tradition says the same thing. The world before the flood was better, more complete, more connected to the divine or the cosmic order, and the flood destroyed that connection, leaving the survivors in a diminished world. What was actually better about the pre-flood world? The conventional answer is that this is psychological projection, the universal human tendency to imagine that the past was better than the present, to locate the golden age behind rather than ahead. This tendency is real and well documented. Every generation looks back at the previous generation and finds it superior. Every culture has a myth of decline, of fall from a better state. But the consistency and the specificity of the pre-flood golden age tradition across so many independent cultures suggests something more than pure psychology. The traditions are saying something specific, not just that the past was generally better, but that the pre-flood past was specifically different in ways that the flood destroyed. The closeness to the divine, the longer lives, the presence of beings who are more than human, the knowledge that was transmitted before the flood and partially lost in it. These specific claims, the divine beings, the longer lives, the transmitted knowledge, are not what you would expect from a purely psychological golden age projection. They are specific historical claims about specific aspects of a specific world. And the question is whether they are memories. Whether the pre-flood world was genuinely characterized by features that we would recognize as different from the post-flood world, or whether they are elaborations, projections, the mythological magnification of ordinary human nostalgia. I don't think that question has a definitive answer, but I lean toward thinking that the traditions are preserving something real, something about the ecology and the culture and the social organization of the coastal worlds that were lost in the flood. That their mythological encoding has transformed beyond easy recognition. The coastal peoples who lost their worlds to the rising sea were not simply displaced. They were also ecologically impoverished. The coastal marine ecosystems that they had lived alongside and depended on for food and medicine and trade were disrupted or destroyed. The rich intertidal zones, the sheltered bays and estuaries, the productive shallow seas, all of these were transformed as the sea level rose. The post-flood world for these people was not just geographically different, it was ecologically different. The resources were different. The social networks built around specific coastal geographies were disrupted. The knowledge of specific places, the locations of fish runs, the seasonal patterns of marine mammals, the medicinal plants of specific coastal environments, was made irrelevant by the disappearance of those environments. The lost knowledge of the pre-flood world is not mythological, it is ecological. The survivors of the sea level rise lost specific, practical knowledge about specific places that no longer existed. That loss was real. And the traditions encode it as the loss of a richer, more knowledgeable world, because it was. And now, let me thread this back to what we know about the world before the Younger Dryas, because the threads of this series converge here. We have been, across these videos, building a picture of the world at the end of the Ice Age, the Natufian communities in the Levant on the verge of agriculture, the Clovis people in North America living alongside the megafauna, the communities of the Gulf Oasis flourishing in the fertile valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the Indian Ocean, and possibly more sophisticated communities in areas we have not yet studied, on the continental shelves that are now underwater, in the coastal lowlands that are now seafloor. The Younger Dryas, at 12,900 years ago, disrupted all of this. The climate shifted. The sea level rise, which had been proceeding, was interrupted. The megafauna began to decline. The Natufian villages were abandoned. The world that had been heading toward something, toward the kind of settled, complex, culturally sophisticated existence that eventually produced cities and writing, was pushed back. And when the Younger Dryas ended and the Holocene began, the world resumed its interrupted trajectory, but from a different starting point. The populations were smaller, the megafauna were gone, The coastal lowlands were further along in their submersion. And the civilizations that eventually emerged in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, emerged with a specific kind of cultural memory. The memory of a world that had been better. The memory of a catastrophe that had ended it. The memory of the need to preserve and transmit the knowledge that had almost been lost. The flood traditions are the cultural encoding of this memory. Not accurate history in the specific sense, but accurate history in the essential sense. Something was lost, the world changed, and the survivors tried to remember. We are still the survivors. We are still trying to remember. Let me spend more time with the specific lost landscapes because I think they deserve more than a catalogue. Each one of them was a world. Each one had people in it. And their loss was not just geological, it was human. Deucalion is the name given by archaeologists to the now submerged land that connected Britain to continental Europe across what is now the North Sea. At its maximum extent, during the glacial maximum, Deucalion was vast, a landscape of rivers, marshes, forests and coastal plains that was probably one of the richest hunting and gathering environments in all of northern Europe. The rivers of what would become the Thames, the Rhine, and the Seine all drained northward through Deucalion and into a single, large river system that flowed into what was then the North Atlantic, somewhere in what is now the deep water north of Scotland. The rivers would have been rich with salmon. The estuaries and marshes would have supported enormous populations of waterfowl. The coastal plains would have been grazed by the megafauna, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, cave lions, giant deer, and people lived there. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary, recovered mostly by accident. Fishing vessels trawling the North Sea floor have brought up organic material, animal bones, and occasionally human artifacts from the Deucalion deposits. A specific find from 1931, a barbed antler point hauled up in the nets of a fishing boat in the central North Sea, is one of the most evocative objects in the whole of British prehistory. It is a bone tool carefully made from a culture that no longer has a name, from a world that is now underwater. The most recent estimate, based on sediment coring and geophysical surveying, suggests that Deucalion was finally inundated around 8,000 years ago. That the last high ground disappeared beneath the rising North Sea at approximately that date. The people who lived on that last high ground, an island or a peninsula in what was becoming an inland sea, watched their world shrink to nothing. What did they feel? What stories did they tell? Did they try to warn whoever came after them? Did they know the water would keep rising? We cannot know. The oral traditions that might have carried their memory were absorbed into the larger cultural traditions of the continental European and British populations that they merged with as they fled the rising sea. Any specific Deucalion flood memory is now so thoroughly blended with the broader Northern European flood traditions that it cannot be separated out. But it was there. The experience was there. The grief of watching the world you grew up in disappear beneath the water was there. And the traditions that survive, the Norse flood myth, the Celtic traditions of drowned lands and sunken cities that dot the folklore of the British Isles and the Atlantic coast of Europe, may preserve fragments of that experience, however thoroughly transformed. The legends of sunken cities in Celtic tradition are particularly interesting in this context. The legend of Cantre'r Gwaelod, the drowned kingdom beneath Cardigan Bay in Wales, describes a fertile lowland protected from the sea by a sea wall, whose keeper let the water in through neglect or drunkenness, drowning the kingdom. The legend of Wise, the sunken city off the coast of Brittany in France, tells of a city built below sea level, protected by great gates, whose destruction comes when the gates are opened to the sea. These traditions are medieval in their written forms, but they describe a specific geography, the shallow coastal waters of the eastern Atlantic, where the continental shelf is wide and was once dry land, that was genuinely submerged in the post-glacial period. The tradition of a rich, inhabited land now beneath the sea is not pure fantasy. It is a mythologized memory of an actual geological reality. Beneath Cardigan Bay there is a drowned forest, the remains of trees that grew when the bay was dry land, still preserved in the sediment of the sea floor. The stumps are occasionally exposed at low tide on the beaches at the bay's margins. They are the material evidence that the legend is pointing at something real. The drowned forest is there. The land that was lost is documented in the wood of trees that grew there before the sea came in. Cantrea Gwaelod is not mythology, it is memory. Let me spend some time with the question of how the flood traditions relate to each other across time, not just geographically, but chronologically. When did the oldest versions of these stories exist, and what did they contain that later versions have lost? This is a methodological challenge because we only have access to the written forms of the traditions, and the written forms are always later than the oral forms they are based on. The oldest written flood narrative, the Sumerian versions from approximately 2100 BCE, was already drawing on oral traditions that were older, perhaps by millennia. The oral traditions that preceded the written Sumerian accounts were themselves drawing on even older traditions. We are always reading a copy of a copy of a copy with no access to the original. But there are ways of inferring what the earlier versions of a tradition contained. Comparative mythology, the systematic comparison of related traditions, can sometimes reveal elements that are present in all or most versions of a tradition, and are therefore likely to be among the oldest elements, predating the divergence of the different versions. The comparative method suggests that the oldest layer of the flood tradition, the layer that predates the divergence into the various regional forms we know, contained the following elements: catastrophic water, a single chosen survivor, a vessel, the preservation of something valuable through the catastrophe, and a new world beginning after the waters recede. The divine warning, the specific animals, the birds, the mountain, the covenant. These elements appear in some versions but not all, suggesting they were added at later stages of the tradition's development. The minimum core, water, survivor, vessel, preservation, new world, is the oldest recoverable layer. And this core is consistent with the basic experience of surviving a coastal inundation. You need water, the flood itself, a survivor, someone who makes it through, a vessel, something to float in, the preservation of what matters most, and eventually dry land. The tradition, at its oldest recoverable core, is simply the story of surviving a flood. The theological and narrative elaborations, the divine judgment, the chosen survivor's righteousness, the covenant, are later additions that shaped the core experience into a story with meaning, with moral logic, with a theological framework that each culture used to understand why catastrophes happen. This is how oral tradition works. It takes the raw experience and gives it meaning. It takes the factual, the flood happened, and gives it a why. The why varies across cultures because each culture has its own theological framework. But the fact, the flood happened, persists beneath all the various whys. The fact is, the memory. The why is the interpretation. And understanding which is which, distinguishing the memory from the interpretation, is the task that comparative mythology is engaged in when it studies the flood traditions. Let me now think about what the convergence of all these traditions, taken together, tells us about the event or events they are pointing toward. If the traditions are genuinely independent memories of the same event or series of events, then the convergence of their testimony is the closest thing we have to a witness account of what happened. Multiple independent witnesses, each seeing a different part of the same event, each describing it through their own cultural and linguistic framework, each transmitting their description across thousands of years of oral tradition, and each stripped of their cultural specifics, saying essentially the same thing. The water came, the world ended, someone survived, the world began again. What does this tell us about the event? It tells us that it was experienced globally, not in every part of the globe simultaneously, but across a wide enough geographic range that populations on multiple continents, separated by oceans and mountain ranges and thousands of miles, all experienced a version of it. The sea level rise meets this criterion. It affected every coastal population on Earth across a period of several thousand years. It tells us that it was catastrophic in the deepest sense. Not just physically destructive, but world-ending. The traditions do not describe a very bad flood that eventually went away. They describe an event that permanently changed the relationship between the world and its inhabitants. The world after the flood is not the same as the world before. This is consistent with the scale of the post-glacial sea level rise. The world genuinely was permanently changed. The coastlines, the lowlands, the habitable areas, the ecological communities, all of these were fundamentally and irreversibly transformed. It tells us that survival was exceptional. The traditions do not describe a general survival. Everyone who was on high ground is fine. They describe the survival of a specific individual or family as something remarkable, chosen, divinely sanctioned. This is consistent with a catastrophe that killed large numbers of people, that was severe enough that survival felt like a miracle, rather than simply a matter of having been in the right place. And it tells us that something was lost that could not be recovered. Every version of the flood tradition carries this note of loss. The world after the flood is the world we know, and the world we know is less than what came before. This is the deepest and most consistent message of the traditions, and it is the one that the conventional explanations find most difficult to account for. Why would every culture independently encode the same note of loss? If the flood traditions were simply responses to ordinary flooding events, we would not expect this universal sense that the post-flood world is diminished. Ordinary flooding is destructive but temporary. The water recedes, the survivors rebuild, the world continues. The note of loss in the flood traditions is pointing at something specific. A world that did not come back. A coastline that stayed underwater. A landscape that was permanently and irrevocably gone. That is the post-glacial sea level rise. That is what it felt like from the inside for the people who experienced it. Not a flood that recedes. A flood that keeps coming. A world that keeps shrinking. A coastline that moves inland year by year and generation by generation until the world you grew up in is underwater and the world your grandparents described is inconceivably far below the surface of the sea. That is the event the traditions are remembering. And the note of loss is not mythology. It is accurate. The world before the flood was genuinely richer. The continental shelves, the land that is now underwater, were some of the most productive and habitable terrain on Earth. The loss of that terrain and of the cultures that lived on it was a genuine impoverishment of the human world. We are the survivors. Our world is the world after the flood, and we are still carrying the note of loss encoded in our oldest stories that the people who watched the sea come in left for us to find. I want to spend some time with the specific question of what I am calling catastrophe religions. The way that the memory of the flood is encoded not just in specific flood narratives, but in the deeper structural assumptions of every major religious tradition. Every major religion has a before and an after, a time of original wholeness or divine presence, a fall or a catastrophe or a turning away, and a diminished present that is trying to recover or maintain or transmit what was lost in the transition. The structure is almost universal. In Judaism and Christianity and Islam, it is the fall from Eden, the expulsion from paradise, the state of innocence and divine proximity that was lost, and that the religious tradition is trying in its various ways to restore or compensate for. In Hinduism, it is the descent through the yugas, from the Satya Yuga, the age of truth and perfection, through progressively more degraded ages to the Kali Yuga, the current age of darkness and confusion, which will eventually end and give way to a new Satya Yuga. In Buddhism, it is the fall from a state of primordial awareness into the confusion of ordinary mind, the original enlightenment that is obscured by the accumulation of habitual patterns, which the Buddhist path is trying to recover. In Taoism, it is the fall from the original harmony of the Tao, the state before the distinction between this and that, self and other, good and bad, into the fragmented and contentious world of conventional experience. In the indigenous traditions of the Americas, it is the descent from the earlier worlds, the ladder of worlds through which humanity has climbed to reach the present one, each previous world being destroyed by a catastrophe that was the consequence of human failure to live in right relationship with the cosmic order. Every single one of these traditions has the same basic structure. Something was whole or good or divine or in right relationship. Something happened to disrupt or end that wholeness. And the present is an attempt to recover or maintain or work toward the restoration of what was lost. This is the structure of the flood memory. The flood traditions are not separate from these larger religious frameworks. They are the historical seed from which the religious frameworks grew. The experience of catastrophe, the actual, physical, geological catastrophe of the post-glacial world, is the experiential basis for the religious intuition that the world is fallen, that something important was lost, that the present is diminished compared to what came before. The religious traditions are the theological elaboration of the flood memory. They have taken the specific memory of a specific series of catastrophic events and generalized it into a universal account of the human condition. An account that says, we are beings who have lost something, who are trying to recover it, who organize our lives around the gap between what we are and what we should be. That account is accurate. Not in the mythological sense, not in the sense that there was literally a Garden of Eden, or that the Satya Yuga was a historical period, but in the essential sense, there was a better world. It was lost, and the loss has shaped everything that came after. The better world was the world of the continental shelves and the Gulf oasis and the lost coastal plains. The loss was the sea level rise. And everything that came after, the civilizations, the religions, the philosophies, the persistent human sense that we are not in the right place, that something is missing, that the world should be better than it is the long cultural processing of that loss. This is a very large claim. I want to hold it carefully. I am not saying that all of human spirituality is reducible to the memory of post-glacial sea level rise. That would be an absurd overstatement. What I am saying is that the memory of catastrophic loss, of a world that was and is no more, is one of the deepest roots of the human spiritual impulse, and that the specific catastrophe at the end of the Ice Age was the most significant and most widely experienced loss in the entire history of the species, and that it is therefore one of the most significant roots of the religious traditions that encode the experience of loss and the aspiration to recover what was lost. The flood is not just a story, it is a shaping event, one of the events that made us what we are. Let me now spend time with Plato's account of Atlantis because it connects directly to everything we have been discussing and because it deserves more careful treatment than it usually receives. Plato's account of Atlantis appears in two of his dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias, written around 360 BCE. In the Timaeus, an Egyptian priest tells the Athenian statesman Solon that the Greeks are like children. They have no knowledge of antiquity, no memory that reaches back to the time before a great catastrophe that destroyed the world. The Egyptians, the priest says, have records that go back much further, preserved through the catastrophe by virtue of the Nile's annual flooding, which fertilizes the land and maintains Egyptian civilization through the periodic destructions that periodically sweep over the rest of the world. The priest tells Solon about a great civilization that existed 9,000 years before Solon's time, so approximately 11,500 years before the present, placing it squarely in the period of the post-glacial world. This civilization occupied a large island in the Atlantic Ocean, beyond the Pillars of Hercules. It was powerful, advanced, and eventually corrupt, and it was destroyed in a single day and night, swallowed by the sea, as divine punishment for its moral degradation. The Atlantis story has generated an enormous amount of scholarly and popular attention over the centuries, most of it not very illuminating. The location of Atlantis has been proposed in every ocean, on every continent, and in several implausible alternative geographies. The story has been treated as literal history, as pure allegory, as garbled memory, as deliberate fiction, and as everything in between. What I want to draw your attention to tonight is not the location of Atlantis, but the frame narrative. The part that is not about the island civilization itself, but about the relationship between Egyptian and Greek knowledge of the deep past. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that the Greeks have no memory of the ancient world because periodic catastrophes wipe out civilization and force each surviving generation to begin again without knowledge of what came before. The Egyptians, protected by the Nile's annual floods, which preserve rather than destroy, have maintained their records across these periodic catastrophes and know the history that the Greeks have forgotten. This frame narrative is making a specific claim that the Greeks are ignorant of their own deep past, that the world they know, the world of the historical period, the world of the Olympian gods and the heroic age and the polis, is a very recent development built on the ruins of earlier and more sophisticated civilizations that were destroyed by catastrophes the Greeks have no memory of. Whether Plato invented this framing to serve his philosophical purposes, or whether he was drawing on a genuine Egyptian tradition about the depth of human history, is disputed. The consensus of classical scholarship is that the Atlantis story is a Platonic invention, a philosophical myth created to make specific points about the dangers of hubris and the nature of ideal political organization. But the framing is interesting independent of whether Plato invented it. The claim that human history is much longer than the Greeks knew, that civilizations have risen and been destroyed many times before the current one, is exactly the claim that the flood traditions are making, exactly the claim that the Sumerian king list is making, exactly the claim that the Egyptian Zep Tepi tradition is making. Whether Plato was drawing on genuine ancient Egyptian records or constructing a philosophical frame, the frame he constructed was consistent with what we now know from geology. Civilizations did rise and fall before the current one. The world before the historical period was inhabited by sophisticated human communities. Those communities were disrupted and in some cases destroyed by the catastrophes at the end of the Ice Age. Plato's Egyptian priests may have been fictional, but what they said was true. There is a specific detail in the Atlantis narrative that I find particularly striking in the context of everything we have discussed in this series. The Egyptian priest tells Solon that the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantis also destroyed a great Athenian civilization that existed at the same time. A civilization that was the great enemy of Atlantis, the power that stood against Atlantis's imperial ambitions and defeated them. This Athenian civilization was also destroyed in the catastrophe, along with Atlantis itself. This is a strange detail to include in what would otherwise be a straightforward story about a bad civilization getting its comeuppance. Why include the detail that the good guys were also destroyed? Why not just have Athens survive and triumph? Unless the point is that the catastrophe was indiscriminate, that it destroyed both the corrupt and the righteous, that the flood was not a moral judgment, but a natural event, one that killed without discrimination, that swept away the good and the evil alike. This is a very different theological claim from the Genesis account, where the flood is explicitly a divine judgment, and the survival of Noah is explicitly the result of his righteousness. In the Atlantis narrative, the righteous Athenians also drown. Only the Egyptians, protected by geography rather than by divine favor, survive. The Atlantis narrative, in other words, may be preserving a more accurate memory of the flood than the Genesis account. Not the memory that the catastrophe was a moral judgment, but the memory that it was a natural event, indiscriminate in its effects that happened to populations regardless of their virtue. The moral framework of the Genesis account, the flood as divine judgment, the survivor as righteous, is a later theological elaboration of the raw experience. The Atlantis narrative, with its ambiguous morality and its indiscriminate catastrophe, may be closer to the original experience. The sea came in and killed people, not because they deserved it, because the sea level was rising. Let me spend some time now with the question of what a unified theory of the world flood would actually look like. What kind of account could do justice to all the evidence we have been exploring? A unified theory would need to explain the following things. First, why flood traditions are found in every inhabited corner of the earth, in cultures with no historical contact with each other. Second, why the structural elements of the traditions, the boat, the birds, the mountain, the covenant, are so similar across such different cultural contexts. Third, why the traditions consistently locate the flood in a period that corresponds to the end of the Ice Age and the post-glacial sea level rise. Fourth, why the traditions consistently describe the post-flood world as diminished compared to the pre-flood world. Fifth, why the traditions include a divine warning, a mechanism for the survival of a specific individual that goes beyond what ordinary sea level rise would produce. The sea level rise hypothesis accounts for the first four. The global distribution of flooding experiences during the post-glacial period explains why every culture has a flood tradition. The specific phenomenology of coastal inundation, the boat, the birds, the high ground, explains the structural similarities. The timing corresponds to the geological record, and the actual ecological and cultural impoverishment produced by the loss of the continental shelves explains the consistent note of loss. The fifth element, the divine warning, requires something additional, something specific rather than gradual. An event that provided a warning signal that individuals or communities could act on. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis provides exactly this: an astronomical event, a comet airburst or impact, that was preceded by observable signs in the sky. A meteor shower of unusual intensity, unusual lights, the kind of astronomical display that a culture of careful sky watchers would have noticed and interpreted as a warning. In this unified picture, the flood traditions are memories of two overlapping and interacting catastrophes. The slow catastrophe of the post-glacial sea level rise, which provided the basic flood experience, and the sharp catastrophe of the Younger Dryas event, which provided the divine warning and the acute crisis that the traditions encode as the moment of judgment. The slow catastrophe lasted thousands of years. The sharp catastrophe happened over days or weeks. Both were experienced by the same populations in overlapping time periods, and both contributed elements to the developing tradition. The divine warning is the memory of the Younger Dryas impact. The flood itself is the memory of the sea level rise. The chosen survivor is the memory of the specific communities that were prepared, that had boats, that had stored food, that had the knowledge and the social organization to survive what came. And the diminished post-flood world is the memory of both, the lost coastlines and the lost knowledge, and the shattered communities, and the 1,200 years of Younger Dryas cold that made the recovery so much harder than it would otherwise have been. This is a unified account. It is not proven. It is not the scientific consensus. It is the account that, when you lay out all the evidence and look at it as a whole, makes the most coherent sense of what the traditions are trying to tell us. And it is the account that, sitting with these questions in the quiet of the night, I find most honest, not most comforting. There is nothing particularly comforting about the picture of a world repeatedly disrupted by catastrophe, but most honest, most consistent with the evidence. The flood happened. It happened to our ancestors, and they tried to tell us. Let me say something more about the deep time problem, about why it is so difficult for modern people to take 10,000-year memory seriously, and why we should reconsider that difficulty. We live in a culture that is deeply skeptical of oral tradition. We have been shaped by a post-Enlightenment epistemology that treats written records as the gold standard of historical evidence and oral tradition as inherently unreliable, prone to distortion, subject to the biases and desires of the storytellers, incapable of preserving specific factual information across more than a few generations. This skepticism is not entirely unjustified. Oral traditions do change. They do drift. The game of telephone is a real phenomenon. In the absence of any mechanism for checking accuracy, each retelling introduces small distortions that accumulate over time. But the Aboriginal Australian evidence and the Bismarck Archipelago evidence and the evidence from other cultures whose oral traditions have been checked against independent geological or biological data demonstrates that oral tradition under the right conditions does not behave like the telephone game. It behaves like a carefully maintained archive. The conditions that enable faithful long-term oral transmission are known and identifiable. Regular ritual performance, the tradition is recited at specific ceremonial occasions, not just told informally. Specialist custodians, certain individuals are responsible for maintaining the tradition accurately and are accountable to the community for doing so. Cultural sanctions against modification. Changing the tradition is treated as serious or even sacred transgression. And memorial embedding. The information is encoded in forms that are maximally memorable. Story, rhythm, song, dance, visual art. These conditions are not exotic or unusual. They are the normal features of cultures that take their traditions seriously. And they are present in precisely the cultures whose flood traditions we have been studying. The ancient Mesopotamians had professional scribes and temple specialists responsible for maintaining their traditions. The ancient Egyptians had a priestly class whose central function was the accurate transmission of sacred knowledge. The ancient Indians had a sophisticated system of memorization. The Vedas were transmitted orally for thousands of years with a precision that modern textual criticism finds remarkable. And the Aboriginal Australians, whose traditions Nunn and Reid studied, had, and in many cases still have, elaborate systems of ceremonial transmission, specialist knowledge custodians, and strong cultural sanctions against modification. These are not primitive or unreliable transmission systems. They are sophisticated archival systems, different from written archives, but not less accurate when properly maintained. The dismissal of ancient oral traditions as necessarily unreliable is not a neutral scientific position. It is a cultural bias, a bias toward the literate, toward the written, toward the forms of knowledge preservation that are familiar to modern Western scholars, and away from the forms of knowledge preservation that are unfamiliar. The Aboriginal Australian evidence should shake that bias. And once it is shaken, once we accept that 10,000-year oral memory is possible and documented, the flood traditions of the ancient Near East and the Americas and Asia look different. They look less like naive mythology and more like imperfect but genuine historical evidence. Let me also spend time with the specific contribution of each major tradition to the unified picture. The Mesopotamian tradition contributes the most historically specific version. The Sumerian king list, the Atrahasis epic, the Gilgamesh flood narrative. These are detailed, literate, carefully maintained records that preserve specific claims about specific people in specific places. The 8 antediluvian kings, the 5 cities, the 432,000 years, the Apkallu, the specific divine motivation for the flood, the specific dimensions of the survival vessel. These details, however mythologized, suggest a tradition that was trying to preserve historical specificity, that understood itself as a record, not just a story. The Hindu tradition contributes the cosmic dimension, the connection between the flood and the great cycles of time, the yugas, the understanding that what happened at the end of the Ice Age was not a one-off event, but part of the universe's fundamental rhythm of creation and destruction. The Manu tradition, with its fish avatar of Vishnu, connects the flood to the deepest structures of Hindu cosmology in a way that suggests the flood was not experienced as an isolated disaster, but as a moment of cosmic significance, a hinge between ages. The Greek tradition contributes the philosophical dimension, particularly through Plato's framing of the Atlantis narrative, which places the flood in the context of a broader understanding of human history as cyclical, of civilizations as repeatedly arising and being destroyed, of knowledge as fragile and the transmission of knowledge as a central human responsibility. The Greek tradition asks, what do we owe to the knowledge of the past, and what happens when that knowledge is lost? The Aboriginal Australian tradition contributes the empirical dimension, the documented, verified, geologically confirmed evidence that oral tradition can preserve specific geographical information across 10,000 years. It is the proof of concept that makes everything else in this discussion more credible. The Mesoamerican tradition contributes the cyclical and catastrophist dimension, the understanding that the world has been through multiple catastrophes, that each age ends in destruction and a new age begins, that the current world is not the first and may not be the last. This tradition takes the flood most seriously as evidence about the structure of time, as evidence that the universe periodically resets, that the current world is provisional, that catastrophe is not exceptional, but structural. And the Norse tradition contributes something different from all of them, the cosmological integration. In the Norse framework, the flood is not an external event that happens to the world. It is part of the world's fundamental structure. The primordial waters are always there. The precarious balance between order and chaos is always maintained only by effort. The catastrophe is always imminent. This is the tradition that most honestly encodes the existential reality of living in a world that has been through catastrophes and will go through them again. Not the confident covenant of Genesis. Never again the flood. But the Norse understanding. The flood came from the beginning of things and will come again at the end. The world is not protected. It is maintained. Together, these traditions form a chorus. Each voice is different, different language, different theological framework, different cultural context. But the chord they form is recognizable. The world was lost. Someone survived. The world began again, and the memory of the loss is still with us. That memory is not a burden. It is a gift. It is the gift of knowing that catastrophe is survivable, that the species has been through this before and come out the other side, that the world that comes after the catastrophe, however diminished, is still a world worth building in and living in and loving. The flood traditions are not ultimately stories of loss. They are stories of survival. The note of loss is real. The pre-flood world was better in some ways than the post-flood world, but the survival is also real. The fact that we are here, that there is a we, that the species made it through, is the other half of the story. Utnapishtim survived. Noah survived. Manu survived. Deucalion survived. The wooden people of the Maya were destroyed, but new people were made. The giants of the Norse world were mostly drowned, but Gilgamesh survived. Every tradition says the same thing about survival. It is possible. It requires preparation, and sometimes divine assistance, and sometimes luck. But it is possible. And we are the proof. Let me think about what it means to inherit this specific story, the flood story, the catastrophe story, as the foundational narrative of the species. Every culture has founding myths, stories that explain where the culture came from, what it stands for, what its relationship is to the divine and the natural and the human. These founding myths shape how the people who hold them understand themselves and their world. The flood story is not exactly a founding myth. It is a founding trauma. The story of how everything was destroyed and how something survived. The story of the gap between what was and what is, and the determination to carry something across that gap. Cultures that found themselves on this story, on the memory of catastrophe survived, tend to develop specific characteristics. A profound respect for the fragility of civilization. A commitment to preserving knowledge, to writing things down, to maintaining traditions, to building archives and libraries and monuments that will outlast the individual and maybe the generation. A sense that the present is precarious and that the future requires care and investment. These are the characteristics of the civilizations that produced the Great Pyramid and the Sumerian King List and Göbekli Tepe. Civilizations that were trying, in different ways, to preserve something across time, to make something that would last. They were building on the memory of the flood, building in the knowledge that the world could end, building with the determination that what mattered most would not be lost again. That determination, that specific civilizational impulse toward preservation and transmission, is one of the things that makes human civilization distinctive. Not the intelligence, not the technology, the determination to pass things on, to build for people who are not yet born, to invest in a future that we may not live to see. The flood gave us that determination, or rather the experience of catastrophe, of watching a world disappear beneath the water, burned into the cultural DNA of the species, the understanding that nothing lasts forever, and that the most important things need to be actively preserved. We are the beneficiaries of that lesson. Every library, every archive, every university, every monument designed to outlast its builders. All of these are expressions of the impulse that the flood gave us, the impulse to preserve, to transmit, to say, this matters, and I am going to make sure it survives me. The flood traditions are themselves the oldest expression of that impulse, the earliest human attempt to preserve the memory of something that was lost, across a gap of time so great that the specific details of what was lost are no longer recoverable. We still have the impulse. We have lost the specific memory. But the impulse, the determination to preserve, to transmit, to pass something on, is still here. In every book ever written, in every school ever built, in every act of teaching and learning and remembering, in every video listened to in the dark by someone trying to hear what the ancient voices are saying, the story continues. You are part of it. We have come a long way tonight. We started with a fire in the dark and someone telling a story about water. We have traveled through the flood traditions of Mesopotamia and India and Greece and the Norse lands and the Maya and the Aztec and the Aboriginal Australians and the people of the Pacific and the peoples of Africa. We have sat with the question of why all of these traditions, developed independently across the globe, tell the same basic story. And we have arrived at an answer, not a final, certain, academically proven answer, but an honest one that takes the evidence seriously. Before we begin to let the night go, I want to spend some time pulling the threads together. Not just the threads of tonight's video, but the threads of the whole series so far. We have explored 6 videos in this series: the Sumerian king list and the 432,000 years before the flood, the comet that may have ended the last ice age, Göbekli Tepe and its carved warning, the Great Pyramid and its impossible precision, and now the flood traditions of every culture on Earth. Each video has been a different angle on the same question, the question we have been circling without ever quite stating it directly, until now. The question is this: is human civilization as old as we think it is? The conventional answer is approximately 5,000 years. Writing, cities, complex social organization, monumental architecture, all of these appear in the archaeological record at roughly the same time, in roughly the same geographic regions, at roughly 3000 BCE. This is the conventional beginning of civilization. Everything before it is prehistory. The long, slow, undocumented accumulation of biological and cultural evolution that eventually produced the conditions for the civilizational leap. The evidence we have been exploring across this series is pointing toward a different answer. Not a certain answer, not a proven answer, but a different one. The evidence suggests that human beings were developing complex social organizations, sophisticated astronomical knowledge, and the capacity for large-scale monument building long before 3000 BCE. Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. The Green Sahara cultures whose traditions fed into Egyptian civilization were active 7,000 to 10,000 years ago. The Aboriginal Australian oral traditions preserve specific geographical information from 10,000 years ago. The Sumerian king list claims that civilized life began before the flood, which the geological evidence places at approximately 8,000 to 12,000 years ago. And the flood traditions of every culture on Earth are pointing toward a specific period, the end of the Ice Age, as the moment of catastrophic disruption that reset the trajectory of human civilization. The picture that emerges from all of this is not the conventional picture of a slow, gradual, uninterrupted accumulation leading to the civilizational leap of 3000 BCE. It is a picture of a longer, more complex, more disrupted process, of human communities developing sophistication across many thousands of years, in many different places, in landscapes that no longer exist. Of a catastrophic disruption, the Younger Dryas and the post-glacial sea level rise, that destroyed much of what had been built and forced the survivors to begin again. And of a recovery that eventually produced the historical civilizations we know, carrying within their traditions the memory of what was lost. This is not a fringe hypothesis. It is the picture that emerges when you take seriously the following things: the geological record of sea level rise and climate disruption at the end of the Ice Age, the archaeological evidence from sites like Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa, the verified long-term memory capacity of oral traditions like the Aboriginal Australian ones, and the consistent structural testimony of the flood traditions themselves. None of these individual pieces of evidence proves the picture, but together they suggest it. And the suggestion is strong enough that it deserves serious engagement rather than dismissal. What would change if this picture is correct? It would change the story we tell ourselves about human capacity. If human beings were developing sophisticated cultures 10,000 years ago, not just in the Fertile Crescent, but potentially on the continental shelves and the now submerged coastal plains around the world, then the capacity for civilization is not a recent development. It is a deep human capacity that was expressed earlier than we thought, disrupted by catastrophe, and expressed again in the form we recognize as history. This changes the question from why did civilization appear so recently to what prevented it from appearing sooner, and what ended what had appeared before. The answer to the first part of that question, what prevented earlier civilization from leaving a visible record, is that it was in places we cannot currently study, on the seafloor, under the sediments of the Nile Delta, beneath the sands of the Sahara. The answer to the second part, what ended what had appeared before, is the catastrophe, the Younger Dryas, the sea level rise, the combination of events that the flood traditions are preserving as the memory of the world that was lost. And the answer to the question of why we know about all of this, why the memory survived when the physical evidence did not, is the human impulse to preserve and transmit that we have been discussing throughout this video. The traditions were the archives. When the physical world was destroyed, the stories survived. Let me spend time with the specific researchers who have been most important in developing the evidence and arguments we have been exploring across this series, because they deserve acknowledgement beyond the brief mentions they have received in individual videos. Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed, whose work on Aboriginal Australian oral traditions and sea level rise has done more than any other single piece of research to establish the empirical case for long-term oral memory. Their willingness to take seriously the possibility that ancient traditions preserve genuine historical information and their rigorous methodology for testing that possibility represents exactly the kind of careful, evidence-based engagement with traditional knowledge that the field needs more of. Robert Schoch, the Boston University geologist whose analysis of the Sphinx erosion opened up the question of Egypt's deep past. Whatever one thinks of the specific claims he has made, Schoch's fundamental contribution, bringing rigorous geological analysis to bear on an archaeological question, is legitimate and important. The erosion features he identified are real. They require explanation. And his willingness to follow the evidence to an uncomfortable conclusion and to maintain that position under sustained professional pressure reflects a genuine scientific integrity. Martin Sweatman, whose work on the astronomical hypothesis for Göbekli Tepe has introduced a specific and testable interpretation of what Pillar 43 is encoding. Whether he is right or wrong about the specific constellation identifications, the broader question he is asking, whether ancient monuments encode astronomical information as a form of long-term record-keeping, is exactly the kind of interdisciplinary question that is likely to produce important results. Jeffrey Rose, whose Gulf Oasis hypothesis connects the geography of the Persian Gulf Basin to the origins of Sumerian civilization in a way that is both scientifically grounded and consistent with the ancient traditions. His work represents the kind of research using geological and oceanographic data to reconstruct the human geography of the pre-flood world that will eventually provide the empirical foundation for the broader picture we have been developing. And the Younger Dryas Impact Hypothesis team, James Kennett, Alan West, and the many researchers who have contributed to the multi-decade investigation of the YDB layer, whose work, whatever its ultimate verdict, represents a genuine attempt to understand a genuine anomaly in the geological and archaeological record. These researchers are not all in agreement with each other. Some of them would be uncomfortable being grouped together. They come from different disciplines, with different methodologies and different standards of evidence. But they are all, in their different ways, responding to the same thing: the evidence that the end of the Ice Age was more catastrophic, and the world before it more developed than the conventional picture acknowledges. They are trying to hear what the ancient voices are saying, and so are we. Let me say something about the specific emotion that I experience when I think about the flood, when I hold the whole picture together and feel what it means. It is not simply sadness. Sadness is the right word for the loss, for the 10,000 years of accumulated culture that went down with the continental shelves, for the specific communities who watched their world disappear beneath the rising sea, for the Deucalion people holding out on their shrinking island until there was nothing left. But there is something else alongside the sadness, something that I find harder to name. It is the feeling of being connected to something much larger than myself. Not in a vague spiritual sense, not a connection to the cosmos or to the divine, though I do not want to dismiss those connections, but a specific, historical, human connection. A connection to the people who told these stories, who sat around fires and spoke the words that eventually became the written traditions we can read, who understood that the world could end and decided that the most important thing they could do was make sure that certain things survived. They were doing what we are doing. They were sitting with the evidence, the water coming in, the coastline shrinking, the land they had known disappearing, and trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it, trying to encode the understanding in a form that would survive them. The form they chose was story. We have other forms now: databases, stone inscriptions that can be dated, ice cores, satellite images of the sea floor. But the impulse is the same, the impulse to know, to understand, to pass it on. When I think about the flood in this way, not as an ancient myth, but as a human experience that I am connected to through the long chain of people who told the story, I feel something that I can only describe as gratitude. Gratitude to the specific people who sat by their fires and told their children about the water, who taught their children to remember the specific places that were under the sea now, who embedded the information in songs and rituals and carefully maintained oral traditions so that it would survive them. They did not do this for us. They did not know we existed, but they did it in a way that eventually reached us. And we are the beneficiaries. We know what happened. Not perfectly, not completely, not in the specific and verifiable way that we would prefer, but we know the shape of it. The water came, the world changed, someone survived, and the survivors tried to tell whoever came after. That telling across 10,000 years and every language and every culture is one of the most remarkable achievements of the human species. Not the pyramids, not the writing, not the cities, the storytelling. The specific, persistent, determined human act of carrying important information across the catastrophe in the only vessel that was available and delivering it to a future that could not have been imagined. The vessel was story, and the story arrived. Let me think about what it means that we are at this specific moment, this particular generation, in the long unfolding of this understanding. Every generation before us has had access to pieces of the picture. The ancient Egyptians had the Zep Tepi tradition and the Turin king list. The Babylonians had the king list and the flood narrative. The Greeks had Plato's account of Atlantis. The Aboriginal Australians have always had their coastal traditions. But no one outside their communities was listening carefully until Nunn and Reed came along. And every generation before us has been missing pieces. The Sumerian scribes who copied the king list did not know about Göbekli Tepe or the Younger Dryas. The Egyptologists of the 19th century, who first identified the water erosion on the Sphinx, did not have the paleoclimatological data to evaluate what it meant. The archaeologists who excavated Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s did not have the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis to contextualize the astronomical imagery. We have more pieces than any previous generation. Not all of them, far from it, but more. The ice cores, the sea level data, the YDB layer, the Aboriginal Australian memory studies, the Göbekli Tepe excavations, the Gulf Oasis hypothesis, the muon tomography of the Great Pyramid. Each of these is a piece of the picture that was not available to previous generations, and together they are beginning to show a picture that no previous generation could fully see. We are at a specific moment in the long process of recovering the memory of the flood, not the end of that process. There are many more pieces to find, many more studies to conduct, many more underwater sites to investigate, but closer to the picture than any previous generation. That is a privilege, and it comes with a responsibility. The responsibility is to be honest about what we know and what we don't know, to take the evidence seriously, all of it, including the evidence from traditions that the mainstream has been too quick to dismiss, and to keep asking the questions, even when the questions are uncomfortable, even when they challenge frameworks that have been productive and important. The people who built Göbekli Tepe and carved the king list and preserved the flood traditions across 10,000 years of oral transmission did not do it so that we could dismiss it. They did it so that someone would eventually hear it. We are that someone. We have the obligation to listen. And now, at the end of a long night of listening, I want to let the stories rest. Not to forget them, not to set them aside as though they were merely academic, but to let them settle into whatever part of the mind or the heart receives old things. The part that processes deep time, that holds the knowledge of catastrophe survived, that carries the note of loss without being overwhelmed by it. There is a specific quality to the knowledge that the world has ended before and will end again. A knowledge that every human being who has ever taken the flood traditions seriously has had to find a way to live with. It is not a paralyzing knowledge. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had it, and they built. The Sumerians had it, and they wrote. The Egyptians had it, and they built the pyramids. Every civilization that came after the flood had it, encoded in their founding traditions, carried in their cultural DNA. And every one of them built anyway. The knowledge that the world can end does not prevent building. It shapes building. It makes the building more serious, more determined, more invested in permanence. It produces the impulse to make something that will last. You carry that knowledge now, not as a burden, as an inheritance. The flood traditions gave it to you. The people who told the stories gave it to you. Every generation that carried the memory forward gave it to you. And what you do with it, how you build, what you preserve, what you pass on, is your part of the long human project of carrying something important across the next catastrophe, whatever form it takes. That is the responsibility that comes with being this far into the story. And it is also the gift. The night is very deep now. The questions are very large. And the world is very old. Let everything settle. Let the fire in the dark become just a memory of warmth. Let the voices telling the flood stories recede into the quiet that holds all the stories ever told. The Sumerian scribes and the Aboriginal elders and the Vedic rishis and the Mayan priests and the Norse skalds and the Egyptian priests who told Solon that the Greeks were children, and all the unnamed people around all the unnamed fires across all the unnamed centuries who told their children about the water. Let them rest. They did their part. They told the story. They kept it alive long enough to reach us. And we received it. That is enough. Let your body settle now. Let the weight of 10,000 years of storytelling be not a burden, but a rest. The rest that comes from knowing you are not alone, that you are part of something much larger and much older than any individual life, that the thread you are holding has been held by so many hands before yours. The sea level has stabilized. The Younger Dryas ended 11,700 years ago. The world that came out of the catastrophe, imperfect, diminished in some ways, richer in others, is the world we have, the world our ancestors built in the aftermath of the flood. The world that produced writing and cities and hospitals and music and mathematics and the capacity to read the ice cores and the sea floor and the light from distant stars. It is not the world before the flood. That world is gone. The continental shelves are under the sea. The Gulf Oasis is 60 meters below the surface of the Persian Gulf. Deucalion is the North Sea floor. But it is a world, warm and complicated, and full of things worth caring about. Full of people trying to understand, trying to build, trying to pass something on. Full of people lying awake in the dark, listening to old stories about water. Let the water recede one final time tonight. Let the coastlines stabilize. Let the bays and headlands and offshore islands of the Aboriginal Australian coast settle into the sea that has covered them for 8,000 years and will cover them for a long time yet. Let the Gulf Oasis rest under its water. Somewhere down there, under 60 meters of salt water and sediment, are the traces of the communities whose descendants eventually wrote the King List. The fields and the houses and the sacred places of people who watched the sea come in and had to leave. They left. They survived. They told the story. And here we are, still telling it. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing you need to understand right now. The flood will still have happened when you wake up. The traditions will still be there. The questions will still be there. And I will still be here in the quiet, wondering about very old things. The world ended. The world began again. And you are here in it at the end of a very long night. Sleep well.